Get ready to hear some timeless historical radio broadcasts. Thank you for visiting Golden Age Radio. Listen to the complete NBC and CBS D-Day broadcasts on rebel.com/C/GAR. Support our veterans by visiting veteransradioministry.com. Let's honor their sacrifice. Thank you.
7:30 a.m. GRUEN, Gruen Precision Watch Time. Gruen Very Thin Watchmaking Miracle. WEAF, New York.
Which marks the launching of the invasion of the European continent, the thoughts of all of us turn to our loved ones who are fighting the big battle over there. The National Broadcasting Company has invited distinguished church leaders to help its listeners in concentrating their thoughts on prayer so that our men and women in the armed forces be given divine protection in their momentous undertaking. The first speaker in this special series this morning will be Dr. Norman Vincent Peale, pastor of Marble Collegiate Church in New York, the oldest Protestant church in America, who is frequently heard over most of these stations. Dr. Peale.
Let us bow in a moment of prayer. Almighty God, God of our fathers, we, thy people, bow humbly before thee on this fateful day of human history. As thou hast guided us and blessed us in the past, so give us now, we beseech thee, thy blessing. Bless the forces of freedom in the mighty assault begun this morning. Overshadow them with thy presence and undergird them by thy strength. March with them, O God, that the forces of evil may not stand before them. In thy might and power, let us prevail. This favor we ask in the name of humanity and for the sake of the oppressed people who suffer under the yoke of Nazi tyranny. Bless thy servant, the President of the United States. Bless our allies. Bless the generals and admirals in command, that they may have a wisdom greater than human to lead this mighty invasion. Bestow upon them the insight of thy mind, and may the mystery of thy guiding spirit, as in times past, brood over the battlefields to give us victory. Bless the men whose lives are offered for freedom this day. Protect, preserve, and defend them, we beseech thee. Especially do we ask thee to draw near to those who must give their lives for God and country this day. In the hour of death, may Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior, be close to them, to give them comfort and solace, and receive them to himself. Help them to know in their hearts that they die in the great tradition of American free men, and give them everlasting peace. Give thy comfort to all parents and loved ones in this crisis. Strengthen and undergird them. Thy mercy on thy people, Lord, and may victory come and a better world result from this historic day. This we ask humbly and sincerely through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen.
Thank you, Dr. Peale. Ladies and gentlemen, NBC has brought you this special message of prayer on D-Day by Dr. Norman Vincent Peale, pastor of Marble Collegiate Church in New York. Other distinguished clergymen will be heard later in the day.
Tuesday morning, June 6, 1944, and this is Don Goddard with your morning news on this day we will never forget. For this is D-Day, the day of invasion, and these last 8 or so hours have been amongst the most important in the history of mankind. Within the last 8 hours, the soldiers of the Allies have landed on continental Europe in at least 2 waves, perhaps more. The air fleets of the Allies have been shuttling death from the airfields of Britain to the armies of Hitler, and the navies of the Allies have been steaming in the waters of the Channel and hurling a great river of steel into the German defenses. And landing barges like scurrying water bugs have churned moonlit waters with ceaseless motion. Yes, the invasion is on. We learned about it first from an unconfirmed report over the German radio beamed to countries outside Germany. That was Eastern War Time, 12:37 this morning. It could have been the invasion, or it could have been just another commando landing. But 3 hours later, Eastern War Time, 3:32 a.m., the official announcement from General Eisenhower, communique number 1, they'll call it in the history books, confirmed that the invasion indeed had been launched. Here are the facts as we know them to this hour. The details are lacking, as you will see, as they must be. No precaution is being overlooked to protect our lads now fighting desperately for a foothold within the very walls of the fortress that Hitler has prepared with such care. In good time, we shall have all the facts, of course. Meanwhile, let's be patient. Historic communique number 1 said simply this. Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France. The Germans say, for whatever it's worth, and it may be sheer propaganda intended to spread confusion, that we have effected those landings on a 75-mile section of the Normandy coast, between the mouth of the Seine River westward to the port of Cherbourg. The Germans tell of a sea battle raging off Le Havre, there at the Seine's mouth. And later, German bulletins add that we had already landed reinforcements near Le Havre and were pushing inland. The Germans, again, also say that much of our strength is concentrated at the city of Caen, which lies 8.5 miles inland from the Normandy shores. Whether that action is by our parachutists who've been landing in swarms behind German defenses all morning, or whether it's actually a penetration from the sea itself, is not clear at this moment. But this is the first action, and others will follow wave on wave. The people of Holland and all along the French coast were warned to evacuate a strip of coastline 22 miles wide to make way for this invasion. That was early this morning. That warning went out with the official invasion announcement and the publication of General Eisenhower's order of the day. This first strip of French soil chosen for our assault lies exactly across the channel from historic English soil, across from the great naval base at Portsmouth, the great port of Southampton, the ports of Dover, Brighton, Hastings, yes, Hastings, where William the Conqueror landed in 1066 in that other invasion, the invasion of England. The port of Le Havre, a great base in the last war and one of France's leading bases now, at one end of this invasion strip, and Cherbourg at the other, will give our armies excellent facilities for pouring supplies and reinforcements into the continent for the battles to come, once we have gained the foothold. This is not the easiest coast in the world to storm. High hills fringe the waters of the estuary, and German guns and fortifications frown from these heights upon the beaches. And how does the battle go? That's difficult to say from this distance at this moment. Several of the eyewitness accounts from reporters who first saw the landing barges nudge the beaches and saw our men scatter ashore under a roaring canopy of fighting airplanes and bombers, who saw them in the dim light of a bomber's moon as they followed the screaming rain of shells that came from the big battle wagons standing in the darkness out there on the channel. They all remarked at the ease with which most of those landings were made, and the general lightness of German opposition. They remarked, too, that the Luftwaffe was notable by its absence. The Germans, of course, are telling of wiping out bridgeheads and of savage fighting and making Americans prisoners, but a late DNB dispatch admits that Allied attacks are taking place rather deep inland now, and they tell of glider attack and numerous paratroopers, and they make one estimate that we've landed at least 4 divisions of airborne soldiers to this hour. That's German talk, of course. The Germans also speak of the great armada that stands in Channel waters. In that, they are as right as rain. It is the greatest assemblage of ships ever to sail together. Prime Minister Churchill has just told us how many in his first statement since D-Day began. Says Churchill, 4,000 fighting ships and many thousand landing crafts and other vessels. 4,000 acres and acres of ships. Nothing like it has ever been seen before. 4 times as many ships in this initial assault on France as were used in the invasion of northern Africa. And overhead, Churchill tells us, roared 11,000 airplanes. Words are not adequate to describe this greatest operation of all time. We have one quote from a soldier who was there and came back, Lieutenant Colonel Frank Perigo of New York, who went over in support of the landing troops. He describes it this way. It's as black as hell on the beachhead areas. It's a scene you can't describe. You can see the flashes of those guns as soon as you leave the English coast. Troops are piling out on the beaches thick as seaweed. The Navy is banging away with broadsides. Our planes are all over the place, but I didn't see any Jerrys. Another soldier, unnamed, an American sergeant packing dynamite and destruction, looked grimly out into the darkness as his barge approached the landing. He set his jaw, and he exclaimed, "They can't stop us." And that, says the correspondent who went along and who stood by his side, is the way they all feel today as they face that biggest job that any army ever tackled. A bulletin from London. Swedish newspapermen in Germany have wired Stockholm that the Allies landed at 12 different places on the French coast. 12 different invasion points between the rivers Orne and Vierre. At this point on the French coast, their spearheads are pointed directly toward Paris. And as the northern coast of France resound to the heavy boots of liberating troops, Allied leaders are speaking to their own peoples today, to the peoples of the occupied countries and to the world, heralding this greatest military operation in history. A few hours before the landings actually got underway, President Roosevelt spoke to the American people last night, referring to the Allied troops who were poised to strike, and doubtless the President knew that D-Day was at hand. Mr. Roosevelt said, speaking of that Allied victory at Rome, Germany has not yet been driven to surrender. Germany has not yet been driven to a point where she'll be unable to recommence world conquest a generation hence. Therefore, the victory still lies some distance ahead. That distance will be covered in due time. Have no fear of that. But it will be tough, and it will be costly. Those are the words of the President of the United States, uttered on the eve of the liberation of Europe. His broadcast was prompted by the fall of Rome, of course, but it was timed to coincide, we believe, with this later and greater operation. And here are two of the latest flood of bulletins that are pouring in here at NBC. The first from London says that the air war against Hitler's cities continues, even though we have 11,000 frontline planes blasting at the Atlantic Wall at this moment. The Royal Air Force struck deep into Germany last night, hit the railway city of Osnabrück. All of the British planes returned safely. And another bulletin from a photo reconnaissance base of the American 8th Air Force. Allied landing forces on the coast of France have established their beachheads, and they're slashing their way inland. The fact is plainly shown in photographs already brought back and developed by our photo reconnaissance men of the 8th Air Force. Leaders of 3 enslaved countries, Belgium, Norway, and Holland, went on the air in London to speak to their peoples at home today. King Haakon of Norway warned his people against premature uprising. In a broadcast heard here at NBC by our monitors, King Haakon said in effect, "Do not rise against the Nazis unless you're a member of the underground forces. And of course, if you are a member of the Norwegian underground armed forces, you have already been given your orders. But if you're just a patriot, keep under cover, ready at all times to aid when the need arises." The Premier of the Netherlands and Premier Pierlo of Belgium had similar messages. They urged their people to resist where resistance is possible, but they warned Belgians and Dutchmen against exposing themselves unnecessarily to Nazi vengeance. "The enemy will try to do everything to provoke you," they said, and General de Gaulle is also scheduled to speak to the French during the day. And from the commanding generals, General Eisenhower and Montgomery, we have some famous quotes, too, quotations that'll go down on that page in the history book. General Montgomery said as he embarked, "It will be a rough show, but it will succeed." And General Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, issued an order of the day to his soldiers and sailors. "Soldiers and sailors, airmen," he said, "you are about to embark on a great crusade. The eyes of the world are upon you, and the hopes and prayers of all liberty-loving peoples go with you. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well-trained, well-equipped, battle-hardened. He will fight savagely. But I have full confidence in your courage, your devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory." In Italy this morning, Fifth Army troops pressed ahead against the weakening German resistance north of Rome, and those Allied troops were heartened by their comrades in arms, by the knowledge that they already were fighting in the fields of France. And news of the Allied invasion of Europe echoed and re-echoed on the Eastern Front, too, along with that Russian frontier that the Red Army is expected to begin pushing to the west at any moment. The latest official word, however, does not tell of any Russian drive. And another bulletin, this one from Naples. Naples headquarters says that Allied troops, French troops, have captured a town 30 miles northeast of Rome, the town of Tivoli. British radio passes the announcement along to our monitors here at NBC. And today, all over the nation, special prayer and church services will be held. And here in New York City, one of the largest will be held this afternoon at 5:30 o'clock in Madison Square Garden. Madison Square, where burns the eternal light as a memorial to the soldiers of the First World War. Mayor LaGuardia has called for a mass ceremony. Said the mayor, we can only wait for bulletins and pray for success. Said Mayor LaGuardia, this is the most exciting moment of our lives. and in all American hearts this morning will re-echo the words which Supreme Commander Eisenhower closed his message to his soldiers and sailors. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking. This is Don Goddard speaking from the NBC Newsroom in New York.
Ladies and gentlemen, earlier this morning, over most of these stations, a distinguished spokesman of the Protestant Churches of America, Dr. Norman Vincent Peale, pastor of Marble Collegiate Church in New York, was heard offering a special prayer imploring divine protection for our armed forces on this day of the invasion of Europe. We are now pleased to present another leading clergyman who will lead us all in turning our thoughts to God in this hour of destiny. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. David de Sola Poole, rabbi of the Spanish and Portuguese Synagogue in New York, the oldest Jewish congregation in America.
In this hour of awe and terribleness, but not in fear, not in doubt, for we know that this dreaded D-Day is the dawning hour of doom for the demonic destroyers, the dawn of the day of destruction for those who have wrought devastation on millions of pitiful men and women and little children. Physically armed as are our sons and brothers, flocking to the invasion, and fighting as they are, men who are desperate, yet we know that their strongest armor is the rightness of their cause of liberation, justice, and brotherhood. And therefore, we turn to thee as the God of battles, certain of the outcome of this gigantic and bitter conflict. Strengthen thou our beloved warriors with clear conscience and with a high sense of dedication, so that, with unshakable faith in the justice of their cause, they may go forward, consecrated not to hatred of men, but to the love of mankind, and to the triumph of liberty over tyranny. Give them the strength to wage to utter victory this final battle against the blasphemers of thy name. May they rapidly and utterly overcome the ruthless oppressor, and thereby bring freedom and life to lands that have been crushed, to peoples that have been robbed, unspeakably outraged, and tortured. And make us, O Lord, in this land that smiles in peace, make us worthy of their heroism, their hardship, their sacrifice, so that when with thy blessing they come back to us in life, uninjured in body and soul, we and they may work together to build in peace, abiding peace for all thy children.
Thank you, Rabbi Poole. Ladies and gentlemen, this was the second special prayer broadcast offered by NBC on this day of the European invasion. You have just heard Rabbi David de Sola Poole of the Spanish and Portuguese Synagogue in New York. Earlier this morning, prayers were offered over most of these stations by Dr. Norman Vincent Peale, pastor of Marble Collegiate Church in New York, the oldest Protestant church in America.
Ladies and gentlemen, as a part of NBC's worldwide coverage, we take you now to Washington and Morgan Beatty.
First of all, here's another quick news summary in the 8th hour of invasion news coverage. Prime Minister Churchill, speaking to Commons today, gave us the first detailed invasion information we've had from official sources. So far, he said, the invasion is proceeding according to plan. And he adds, what a plan. And a bulletin just in from London says Allied soldiers have seized 12 beachheads on the French coast, beachheads which threaten to isolate the entire Normandy Peninsula, and they're also threatening a railroad pointed straight at Paris. To get back to the Prime Minister, he says fire from the German shore batteries has been stopped. And he tells us, too, there are hopes that our landings came as a tactical surprise to the Germans. In terms of statistics, he told Commons and the world that 4,000 ships, in addition to several thousand smaller craft, crossed the channel. And overhead, there were thousands of planes supporting the landing forces. And now I have a part of the story behind those 4,000 ships and the rest of invasion paraphernalia. A few weeks before the signal for invasion, the late Colonel Frank Knox sat in his office in the Navy Department here in Washington at a regular press radio conference. Before anybody could ask a question, he said he had an announcement to make that the United States today has the greatest seagoing battle force in the history of the world. We have more than 900 warships of the major type, which means somewhere between 5 and 10 million tons of fighting ships are plying the ocean ways of the world. Our Navy has the greatest air striking force ever known at sea, with some 25,000 planes ready to hit the enemy in any ocean at any time. When you realize that, we had only 17 battleships in 1941 and lost temporarily about half of those at Pearl Harbor. We had only 7 aircraft carriers and lost 2 of those in fairly rapid order. We had a pitiful 5,000 naval airplanes, many of which were on the way to obsolescence. And as for our Army, then, the growth of that force in 2 short years has been little short of a miracle. From 12,000 planes, only 500 out of them first-rate fighting equipment, we have gone close to 175,000. Before the outbreak of the war in Europe, we had an army of some 300,000 men. By the time of Pearl Harbor Day, we had managed to create an army of nearly 2 million. But today, we have close to 10 million men under arms, most of them fully equipped for battle, nearly 4 million of them not only equipped, but fully trained, ready for the command, attack. In Britain, the story is the same, only more so. How did all this happen? How was it that democracies organized the strength under a 10-year handicap to assault the fortress of Europe by sea today? Our kind of organization, built for peacetime manufacture of baby buggies, bathtubs, and washing machines, and so on, could never have switched over to war machines if the people behind the manufacturing industry and its business, if laboring people and housewives had not buckled down, if scientists, men and women, had not found ways to increase our output quickly. Much of this rapid turnover was a natural product of war. Radio and press played a part in telling us why we had to make sacrifices. So did the movies and lectures and libraries. Some of the turnover was long years of study and planning, such as General Louis B. Hershey put into the law that now selects men for military service, the draft. But in the end, it all boiled down to just people. People who had to carry through. I have people in mind whom I regard as typical ones in the war effort of both nations, Britain and America. I don't know exactly why I think they're typical, but I'd like you to know one of them at any rate, possibly more. I think you'll understand why they're so important to invasion. One of them's a young American, Ben Marcelonis by name, a fellow whose father and mother came over here from one of the Baltic states about 25 years ago. 10 years ago, just after Hitler rode to power, although this is sheer coincidence, young Ben was busy in his father's workshop in Dearborn, Michigan. He was working on another one of those gadgets that exasperated his parents, because Ben's father never knew what would be missing off the family automobile next. On that spring day 10 years ago, Ben was working on a diving helmet. He had found an old hot water tank. He had, shall we say, borrowed the air compressor hose from his father's filling station, and his uncle had given him a hand pump. He completed his project on that spring day 10 years ago and reached the height of his gadgeteering triumph. He became the first youngster to walk underwater at his school swimming pool with the aid of his hot water tank diving helmet. Later on, thanks to the welding he had learned and the amateur excursions, Ben Marcelonis became an arc welder. All of this might have meant nothing at all to so important a project as a world war if it hadn't been that the war came along and they drafted Ben Marcelonis. That was okay with Ben, and ultimately he found himself where I discovered him last year at a bomber station in Britain. And one day last spring, Ben was busy musing over some gadget when up stepped Sergeant Green, a combat crewman. Green had been talking over a design for a gun mount in the nose of the flying fortress. The engineers had said it was impossible to beat the vibration in the nose, and as a result, the ME-109s were coming into the fortress blind spots too often for comfort. Well, Marcelonis didn't have any special materials to work with, so he went to the junk pile in the corner of his bomber station workshop. He found steel plates and some old steel piping, a lot of odds and ends. He cut out the plates for a base and welded the piping on, as he explained to me, at the right places. He spent a week of odd moments taking the gadgets to the bomber for a fitting. He'd bend a leg here and straighten another one there, and finally he got her in, and his bomber crew took her out. They made a killing of ME-109s that day that will long be remembered, because the news got back to the United States in no time at all, and the result was a gun mount in the nose of the fortress that today is blasting a path toward Berlin. Ben, the gadgeteer of Dearborn, a mere private, first class, at the time, received the Legion of Merit Award from Uncle Sam. Not just the regular award, but the officer class. Ben Marcelonis makes war possible.
You have been listening to Morgan Beatty speaking from Washington. We return you now to the NBC newsroom in New York.
The National Broadcasting Company has brought you Morgan Beatty from Washington. Now, for additional comment, we bring you Larry Smith in the NBC newsroom in San Francisco. One moment, please.
Abreast of both the American and Chinese people of San Francisco, a new hope that soon the entire might of the Allied nations could be turned against our other mutual enemy, the Japanese. There was discussion, too, of the effect on the Russian bear, which sits on his haunches at the northern frontier of China, as well as on the boundaries of Japan's satellite, the Hirohito-spawned puppet state of Manchukuo. The first news caught the late street crowds, the sailors and soldiers and Marines, as well as the theater-goers, and the young couples, the men almost invariably in uniform. There was a sudden grimness in the air, a feeling that now the end of the European war was a matter of minutes almost. Victory in 1944, and that we could get along with our other job in the Pacific. Certainly not the true picture, but then these men in uniforms on the streets of San Francisco are bound for the jungles of New Guinea, for the Philippines, perhaps to Burma or India. To them, the war is in the Pacific. It seems the consensus of opinion out here on the Pacific coast that with the defeat of Hitler, the Russian might will be swung into the balance against Japan. I cannot help from recalling the toast of Vladivostok, where every drink of hot rum or vodka is toasted to Dairen, that modern all-year port on the Port Arthur Peninsula, which was handed to Japan in the peace conferences at Portsmouth in 1904, a gift to the Japanese militarism from Theodore Roosevelt. Russia wants the year-round ice-clear port as a Pacific outlet, and for the past 10 years, Russia, or at least Siberia, and Japan have been literally at each other's throats. I recall a Japanese war correspondent returning from Tokyo from the Kwangtung country, boasting that the unit to which he was attached had shot down 24 Russian planes along the Amur River. I have been sitting here listening to Tokyo's broadcasting station so far. We have not heard one word where the Japanese government have told the people of the invasion. But it is easy to picture the activities around the Gaima show in Tokyo tonight. At the offices of the Foreign Minute, so closely tied to the military overlordship of Tojo, the military premier. It carries me back to that September night in 1940 when the three members of the Axis got together in a political, economic, and military dictatorship. So that's the picture tonight.
We return you now to the NBC newsroom in New York.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are privileged at this time to present the Reverend Francis X. Shea, Secretary to Archbishop Spellman, who will offer on this day of the European liberation a special prayer composed by the Archbishop. This will be the third broadcast this morning arranged by NBC in cooperation with the major religious bodies of America. Dr. Norman Vincent Peale of Marble Collegiate Church in New York and Rabbi David de Sola Poole of the Spanish-Portuguese Synagogue in New York were heard earlier in the day. Father Shea will now speak for the Catholic Church. Father Shea.
O God, Father of America, thou hast formed this union of states, sealing it with high destiny, that our nation be light to all peoples in their dark despair, light to all peoples in their fear of death, love to all peoples under their yoke of hate. For this destiny thou dost teach us to fly as the eagle, girding us with lightning and thunder, enriching us with treasures in field and fold. O God, bless America with thy shielding graces, lest we become a nation without light, our eyes turned from thee. A nation without light, our souls sundered from thee. a nation without love, our hearts forgetting thee. O God, give us victory that is just, merciful, and wise. For thou hast chosen America to be the soul of thy justice, the medium of thy mercy, the instrument of thy wisdom. Let all nations know that our justice comes from thy spirit, our mercy from thy heart, our wisdom from thy mind, our victory from thy strength. Bless us, O God, with manifold graces to give freely of what we have, to give fully of what we are, in victory to give ourselves alone to thee. O God, the Father of all nations, hear our prayer for our united peoples. Grant guidance to our leaders, protection to our sons, and teach all of us thy way of life in goodwill and peace.
Thank you, Father Shea. Ladies and gentlemen, in recognition of the fact that the thoughts of all Americans today more than ever are turning to God, imploring divine help and protection for all our loved ones now engaged in the supreme struggle for freedom, NBC has offered this special broadcast as a contribution to the religious life of the nation.
This is station SBT in Sweden, calling PTS in New York. Hello, New York. Hello, New York. Stockholm calling. Place at 12:10 to
reveal that the invading forces had not found the German underwater obstacles as difficult as we had feared, and that the landings on the beaches are still going on. Which means that within 6 hours of the commencement of seaborne operations, the invasion of Europe has cleared the first hurdle. Not only that, but the progress has been so satisfactory in this initial phase that Mr. Churchill felt able to say, "We may have had tactical surprise." This is excellent news, but it's well to remember that the critical period of an operation on this scale is expected to last at least a week. The men are on the beach now, but until enough heavy equipment is ashore to deal with German counterattacks, we are not out of danger. We must expect those counterattacks momentarily. We may be cautious here in London this morning, but don't get the impression we're gloomy. Far from it. The strength that's been thrown into this operation is staggering. Mr. Churchill said that more than 4,000 ships and several thousand smaller craft have already crossed the channel. He told of the mass airborne landings behind the enemy lines. The Germans say we landed 4 divisions by parachute and glider, which may be somewhat exaggerated, but there were at least 20,000. And the Prime Minister gave another example of how many chips we have in this game by announcing that the Allied Expeditionary Force is sustained by 11,000 first-line aircraft, which can be called upon as needed. This is another fact of considerable significance. It's another way of saying that the Royal Air Force is prepared to put its night bombers into the sky by daylight if the need should arise. With the RAF ready to bomb by day in an emergency, we could carry out in any threatened area a bombing offensive without equal or precedent. The British Prime Minister wound up his short resume in the House of Commons by saying that as the battle grows in size and intensity for many weeks, we will give the enemy many more surprises. The remarkably swift development of this first day is pointed up by the fact that Mr. Churchill felt it possible to make the statement he did only 2 hours after the Supreme Command here issued a cautious and vague communique. This communique said only that landing operations in Europe had begun. We're allowed now to release some more details on the action. In the first phase, before the landing, the weather was unfavorable. There were rain squalls and the channel was rough. But by each hour, the weather had changed for the better. And we're also able now to hand a bouquet to the men of the minesweepers who did a magnificent job in clearing the landing areas of thousands of mines under the noses of the German coastal battery. The news of the invasion was originally broken by the Germans at 6:30 this morning, past midnight Eastern wartime. There was no official word from London until 3 hours later. When the news did get around here, there was no dancing in the street. Nobody blew his top, nor is anyone likely to until the outcome is finally assured.
We now take you to a point on the English coast for the first eyewitness account of the naval action. Stanley Richardson reporting.
Scale military invasion operation in history. My
Ladies and gentlemen, there must have been a momentary failure. We ask your indulgence. In just a moment, we'll try to establish contact with Stanley Richardson. One moment, please.
Not a recognizable enemy plane appeared overhead. At least no bombs were dropped at or on any of the ships in our area. No low-flying fighters came over to strafe us with machine gun fire. And no enemy vessel, not even one of their vaunted E-boats, came out to the attack. The officers and men with whom I rode wondered searchingly about this. They had been keyed up with some real German opposition, both from the air and the sea. Their trigger fingers were itching for a scrap. And they were a very disappointed lot at not getting it. If the Germans weren't just too timid to come out, the only other ready explanation that could be advanced was that they were too busily engaged in coping with the Allied air attacks made on their shore establishments as a prelude to the actual landing of troops. In the area we covered, we could see hundreds of bombers and fighters shuttling back and forth, dropping their bomb loads and returning to England for more explosives to blast the enemy. We could see the big two-engined American transport planes, also in the hundreds, returning to their bases in the United Kingdom after dropping their airborne troops in France. Yes, Jerry had a lot to keep him busy last night and early today, but as far as the naval phase of our activity was concerned, not a shot was exchanged with the enemy while I was on the scene. For that preliminary phase of the show, at any rate, it was all too incredibly easy. We left our patrol torpedo boat base at daylight to accompany the slower-moving light advance guard of ships, which had to pave the way for the actual landing. One of our missions was to protect the Allied minesweepers, which cleared a wide channel straight to the enemy shore while troop transports and supply ships. Long lines of ships of every description were discernible on the skyline. Literally miles of craft in even columns converging upon the area in the channel marked for the concentration point for the actual invasion. Huge transports, tank landing ships, smaller troop landing craft, tankers and supply vessels of every kind, plodded doggedly along under lowering skies, tapering over heavy seas. You people at home would have been thrilled to the bone to have seen all these American men, American ships, and American supplies sailing calmly into the action for which they had been prepared and trained for so many months. It was estimated that there were more than 4,000 ships of all kinds in the channel for this combined operation. By nightfall, we were nearing the French coast, and our watch tightened. But nothing happened. Even when a full, near moon, appearing fitfully from behind the clouds, gave our position away clearly to any enemy who may have been lying in wait for us. Then the fast and heavy combat ships moved up into position. All aligned themselves in the bombardment area to loose a hail of high explosives to protect the troops moving into the beaches on their landing craft. The warships started laying their smoke screens preparatory to shooting their guns. It was within only a few minutes of each hour of the long-awaited D-Day. And right there was where I got the biggest disappointment of my life. We turned around and headed back at high speed for the English coast. Our PT squadron was under orders to return to base and refuel for another mission as soon as its first operation was completed. So I didn't even hear the bombardment begin. But I can tell you that if things are going as well now as they looked to be going at the time I left the scene, it won't be long before our troops have a firm foothold. And now here is Merrill Muller at the advanced command post of the Allied forces.
Hello, New York.
Hello, New York.
Hello, New York. Hello, New York. Hello, New York. Hello, New York.
Just one moment, please, and we'll bring you Merrill Muller.
Hello, New York. Please get it.
Go ahead, Muller.
Hello, New York.
The others in yet?
No. Hello. We've got some technical difficulty here. Cut this off the network for the time being if you're calling on this channel. Hello, New York. Hello, New York.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're sorry because of technical difficulties we could not bring you Merrill Muller at his outpost there. Here in New York, in the NBC newsroom, we bring you Elmer Peterson.
As you've heard from our reporters in London before interception was cut off, the invasion is moving ahead according to plan. We are finding the full fruition now of these patient months of preparation. The Germans are resisting. It was expected that they would. But our plans are going ahead. From neutral sources, we're getting steady reports of German claims of where the attack is directed. The Berlin correspondent of the Swedish paper Aftonbladet now asserts that the Allied invasion attack seems directed against the most heavily defended section of the French coast and aimed directly at Paris. This dispatch declares that warships of all kinds, including battleships, have thrown tons of shell at the coast, covering the landings. Other Stockholm dispatches from Berlin say that the Allies have landed at 12 points between the mouths of the Orne and Viry rivers on the Normandy coast, with a central assault directed at Caen. Large forces of parachutists, some of which were described as dummies, were dropped simultaneously in areas about 10 kilometers west of Boulogne and Cherbourg, the dispatches added. And here we have evidence that a great deal of deception undoubtedly will be used as this attack proceeds. The German High Command, in its first invasion communique today, said that Allied forces suffered particularly heavy reverses in the Caen area of northern France, and claimed that an entire regiment of paratroopers were destroyed in that sector. While an earlier German DNB, Deutsche Nachrichtenbüro news agency report told of new Allied landings on the Normandy Peninsula this afternoon, with tanks being put ashore in one sector. It's now apparent that our aim must be that of capturing large ports on the French coast in order to put ashore heavy equipment as soon as possible. There's another report that Allied troops, this report also comes from the German news agencies, that Allied troops have landed on the Channel Islands of Guernsey and Jersey. Meanwhile, of course, we wait for the full results of what must be described as the psychological effect of the invasion on Europe, especially on the Balkan satellite countries and on the neutral countries. The very fact that the invasion has been started is significant. Much depends now, of course, on how fast the invasion proceeds. But the effect is bound to have a startling influence on the satellite countries, which at this time are seeing their final hopes of German victory dissipated. And here's a resume of the invasion so far. It's gone well in the first few hours. We've had Prime Minister Churchill's word that it's going according to plan. Our forces have been storming ashore during these early morning hours behind a terrific air and sea bombardment. American, Canadian, and British troops have seized beachheads, which threaten to isolate the Normandy Peninsula, also to capture a railroad pointed straight toward Paris. It's now known that American troops have knocked out enemy pillboxes and other fortifications along the Atlantic Wall, using the intense striking power which has been assembled during these past weeks and months, if not years. In addition, the German news agency says that Allied forces have battled their way 10 miles inland from the coast of Normandy. And the Germans add that the most important airfields in the Normandy area have been wiped out. This time, those airfields are being wiped out for the last time. The air attacks on those fields may have been remedied, but this time ground forces, heavily equipped, are taking over those airfields. Prime Minister Churchill reported on the progress of the invasion just 6 hours after the first waves of shock troops leapt from their landing craft, and after the first waves of paratroopers poured out of their great planes. Churchill told the House of Commons that upwards of 4,000 ships and thousands of smaller boats crossed the English Channel to begin the attack on the enemy's fortress Europe. One can only imagine the scenes on the English Channel as those thousands of ships, large and small, streamed across those waters towards the enemy shore. We've already had reports that thousands of planes are in operation. Churchill said the Allies can draw on the amazing total of 11,000 first-line planes if need be. One need only recall our first bombing efforts from Britain, utilizing no more than a few hundred planes, to visualize what this must mean, to visualize what it must mean in terms of tonnage of bombs now being dropped upon the enemy. It's doubtful, it would seem, that the German resistance can stand up against this form of attack. Turning to today's operations, Churchill said, and we quote, "Obstacles which were constructed in the sea have not proved as difficult as was expected." One reason for this, of course, is that the Allies sent out a great flotilla of minesweepers, those small vessels which have the difficult task of clearing away mines. The Germans had mined the waters heavily, but these men of the minesweepers did their task efficiently and effectively. It's also clear now that the fire of shore batteries in the invasion areas has been largely silenced. Many of these Nazi shore batteries, as you know, were cleverly concealed. Germans have been working on them for months. But it does seem, and largely no doubt because of the use of our great battleships, with their heavy guns pouring forth a steady rain of shells, largely because of this form of attack, we at last seem to have managed to silence some of these shore batteries at least. Prime Minister Churchill continued, as has been earlier reported, that massed airborne landings have been successfully effected behind the enemy lines, and that landings on the beaches are proceeding at various points at the present time. It's not surprising, of course, that we are seeing this extensive use of airborne troops. It's been known for a long time that we would employ this ultimate of modern warfare, and we have assembled in Britain great numbers of these paratroopers using the most modern of weapons. Their task, of course, is to get behind the German lines if possible, to wreck communications, to destroy German fortifications wherever possible. And it does seem from these reports that the paratroopers are doing their job. Churchill also said, and we're still quoting, "There already are hopes that tactical surprise has been achieved." If true, this undoubtedly will prove to be one of the most significant parts of the invasion, for the Germans have had plenty of time during these past months to anticipate the aim and direction of Allied strategy. They have boasted that they knew exactly what we were going to do. They have claimed to be fully prepared. But in Churchill's words, it does seem that some tactical surprise has been achieved. So far, Churchill went on to say, the commanders who are engaged have reported that everything is proceeding according to plan. Here's another bulletin which has just come in. More than 640 naval guns, ranging from 4 to 16 inches in size, are bombarding the beaches and enemy strong points in support of landing forces. This is a remarkable indication of the extent to which sea power now is ranging alongside air and land power in this final assault, this greatest military adventure in history. It's been known for a long time that our Navy has been assembled for this task. But here, and I repeat the figures, more than 640 naval guns, ranging from 4 to 16 inches in size, now are steadily shelling the beaches and the enemy strong points along that 100-mile stretch of Normandy coast where the Allied forces have landed. And here's a report just in. The Paris radio said today that the battle on the continent, that is on the Normandy Peninsula, seems to be gaining depth. In other words, here is an admission from the enemy side that we are going ahead. Here's an interesting report from London. A few hours after the Allied invasion was announced, long queues of blood donors appeared outside transfusion depots in cities throughout England. The donors presented themselves in accordance with a prearranged plan to begin supplying a stipulated number of bottles of blood for the invasion forces in addition to their normal supply. It calls attention to one apparent fact, that is, that the invasion is going to cost us heavily, of course, in casualties, depending in the long run on how much resistance the Germans manage to offer. And now for a recapitulation. Churchill. I repeat, here is a recapitulation of Churchill's talk. Prime Minister Churchill told a cheering House of Commons today that the Allied liberating assault upon Hitler's European stronghold was proceeding according to plan. And he added, what a plan. Churchill was confident. He reported that the Allied forces had been transported across the Channel to the shores of France by an immense armada of 4,000 ships with several thousand smaller craft, probably, said Churchill, the greatest fleet ever assembled. Churchill's also called attention to the fact that mass airborne landings have been successfully effected behind the enemy's lines. There are already hopes, he said, that actual tactical surprise has been attained. And, he said, we hope to furnish the enemy with a succession of surprises during the course of the fighting. The battle which is now beginning, Churchill warned, will grow constantly in scale and in intensity for many weeks to come, and I shall not attempt to speculate upon its course. Every report now coming in indicates that the actual air attacks upon the continent have hit a new high peak, with constant streams of bombers of every description dumping their loads on this chosen coastal area where our troops are attacking. French patriots have been warned by Allied radios to withdraw to a depth of at least 22 miles from the coast.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the National Broadcasting Company. We want to speak to you a moment about the program that was scheduled at 8 o'clock, the overseas broadcast in which we're to hear Stanley Richardson, the Navy, and Merrill Muller, our reporter at Eisenhower's headquarters. This broadcast failed because of technical difficulties, but we have been advised that the broadcast will take place in just 2.5 minutes at 8:25. So we suggest that you stay tuned here to NBC when we bring you this special broadcast of Stanley Richardson and Merrill Muller. And now again, Mr. Peterson.
In just a matter of seconds, as you've heard, we'll return to London for further direct details of the invasion. Meantime, here is some news from the other fighting fronts. In Italy, Fifth Army troops are driving steadily beyond liberated Rome. Some units have advanced as much as 5 miles from the River Tiber. They're meeting what's officially described as only weak resistance. French troops have captured Tivoli on the Avezzano Highway 30 miles northeast of Rome. And so, with the news of the invasion electrifying the entire world, there's new attention also to what the Russian armies now will do. The Germans are still attacking north of Iasi in Romania, trying to block a Red Army offensive in that area. We have had no reaction from Japan as yet, but it's clear that the Japanese now will intensify their campaign to break up the Chinese war effort. Gradually, the results of the invasion will have their effect around the entire world. The Germans have already admitted the loss of some of their aerodromes, and others, as we've already reported, have been knocked out by our air attacks and also by our land forces. German news dispatches claim that at least 4 Allied airborne divisions landed between Le Havre and Cherbourg, and that heavy fighting is underway around Caen, some 8.5 to 10 miles inland. The Nazis also declare that Allied glider formations have been observed, which seems like understatement considering the announcement in London that up to 4 divisions already are in active operation.
The National Broadcasting Company, through its own reporters where the news is made, through its monitoring of enemy and neutral broadcasts, through the worldwide facilities of the great news-gathering agencies, will bring you all the invasion stories first and as they happen. For a special broadcast now, we take you to London.
This is London. We now take you to a point on the English coast for the first eyewitness of the naval action. It is by Stanley Richardson. Hello, New York. We're having slight technical difficulties. We will try it again.
As you heard, ladies and gentlemen, we're having slight technical difficulties in establishing...
Hello, New York.
contact with
We're
Stanley
encountering
Richardson.
slight
We'll try
technical
again.
difficulties. We will hope to go ahead in just a moment or two.
Stand by, if you will, ladies and gentlemen. We're waiting for them to establish contact.
We regret that we are unable to establish contact with our remote point, so we must conclude this portion of the broadcast from London. We will call in the New York broadcasters again when we are prepared to go forward with this broadcast. We return you now to the United States.
And here again is Elmer Peterson with a roundup of the news.
Our own reports so far indicate that German naval activity has been negligible in the English Channel. The Germans, however, say that a furious sea battle has developed off Le Havre between Nazi motor torpedo boats and the invasion fleet. The Germans also claim to have scored numerous hits on warships, Allied warships, and Allied transports at sea. All these claims so far are without confirmation. It is to be expected, of course, that the Germans will use whatever navy they have left, especially their motor patrol boats and probably small submarines, in their efforts to block the invasion. Their only chance is to cripple the supply line across the English Channel. It also remains to be seen whether the Germans, as has been predicted, may attempt some sort of airborne landing of their own in Britain, some sort of desperate suicidal action in a final effort to break British railway communications directly from the fountainhead of the invasion supplies and the source of invasion manpower. There's new attention, of course, to the American paratroopers. These men have been trained for a long time in Britain now, and the forces now being engaged on the continent are studded with battle-hardened veterans of the Sicilian and Italian campaigns. These are the men who have landed behind Hitler's Atlantic Wall now to strike the first blow of the long-awaited Western Front squarely at the very vital parts of the enemy defenses. These paratroopers are the toughest and wiriest men of the war. The actual site, the actual scene of their assault almost beggars description as they cascaded from faintly moonlit skies in what must have been an awesome operation to watch. Large numbers of twin-engine C-47s, the sisters of America's standard airline flagships, carried the human cargo across the skies, simultaneously towing troop-laden CG-4A gliders. And all of this merged finally into a single sledgehammer blow, paving the way for the frontal assault troops. The paratroopers and our glider-borne infantry are armed with weapons ranging from the most primitive to the most modern. The paratroopers' mission, as I've said, is to disrupt and demoralize the German communications inside the Nazis' own lines. There is no immediate indication that their dynamite, their flashing steel, and their well-aimed fire was not succeeding in the execution of plans rehearsed for months in preparation for the liberation of occupied Europe.
This is the National Broadcasting Company in New York, and we are going to attempt once again to establish contact with Stanley Richardson and Merrill Muller. The special broadcast will come to you from London.
This is London. This is London.
Jan, we shall attempt to take you to a point on the English coast for the first eyewitness of the naval action. It is by Stanley Richardson.
We ask you to stand by, ladies and gentlemen. We are trying to establish contact, as you heard them say in London. Go ahead, London. Go ahead, Stanley Richardson.
Hello, New York. We are still encountering difficulties with this transmission and must again abandon it, at least for the time being. We return you now to the United States.
This is Charles F. McCarthy in the NBC newsroom in New York. The hour is at hand. The news the world has been waiting for is being made. Allied forces are moving inland, driving into the outer rim of Hitler's fortress Europe from landings made earlier this morning on the coast of northern France. American, British, and Canadian troops, airborne and seaborne contingents, were successfully landed in a series of operations starting at midnight Eastern War Time and continuing for 2.5 hours. 4,000 ships and several thousand smaller craft took the main body of the Allied armies in. Earlier, deep penetrations had been made by parachute and glider forces. And a report from Prime Minister Churchill in London a short time ago says this, and I quote, "So far, the commanders who are engaged report that everything is proceeding according to plan. Allied leaders have not yet announced the locations of our landings. They want to use to the fullest extent whatever element of tactical surprise the Allies may have gained. But German broadcasts declare that our landings were made in Normandy, along a stretch of more than 100 miles of beaches that extends from Le Havre to Cherbourg. The Nazis say that the Allied aim is to seize the big ports of Le Havre and Cherbourg, as well as the airdromes of the Normandy Peninsula for a gigantic offensive. There is no denying the indication of gigantic operations, and NBC monitors picked up a British radio report a short time ago saying that our troops have moved at least 10 miles inland. We do know that the beachheads have been secured. That's an official bulletin just in from an 8th Air Force reconnaissance base, and the flyers have the pictures to prove those beachheads. They report that our men are slashing their way inland, but there's no official word yet on the extent of the advance. In addition to the support of warships for the Allied landings, 11,000 airplanes backed up the operation. Our Allied landing troops got their orders from the Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight Eisenhower. The American leader issued his formal order in these words: "You are about to embark on a great crusade. The eyes of the world are upon you, and the hopes and prayers of all liberty-loving peoples go with you. We will accept nothing less than full victory." NBC listeners heard the first official announcement of the invasion at 3:32 o'clock. It was followed by the first communique and General Eisenhower's order of the day. Earlier, the German radio had filled the air with invasion flashes. The Nazi broadcasts emphasized the size and scope of the landing operations and indicated that Allied paratroops were holding positions nearly 9 miles inland. The first Allied fighter pilots to return from flying over the beachheads report that our infantrymen were scrambling up the shores of France at 7 a.m. British time, 1 a.m. Eastern War Time. Apparently, they met no heavy opposition, at least in the early stage of the assault. In charge of the landing operations was the British leader, General Sir Bernard Montgomery. The Allied units leaped onto the shores that Hitler's leaders have spent nearly 4 years in fortifying. Our men struck out as Allied planes and ships hurled terrific barrages into those vaunted Nazi defenses. The forces thrown into the operation were by far the greatest ever used in an amphibious assault. All night long, London and other English cities resounded to the roars of thousands of airplanes, some carrying bombs, others carrying men. Returning RAF bombers met big fleets of flying fortresses on their way out. During the 48 hours previous to the landings, RAF and American bomber fleets dropped a staggering and devastating tonnage of bombs on the West Wall's defenses. One of the most difficult things on this D-Day is for us at home to grasp some idea of the immensity of the operations. Certainly, it is the greatest battle, the greatest military feat of all time. Prime Minister Churchill, in his report to the House of Commons, says as much, describes the mighty armada that sailed against the coast of France as the greatest assemblage of ships ever to sail together. 4,000 fighting ships, ships of war, and many thousands of landing craft besides. And to sustain the operations, 11,000 aircraft. 11,000. Certainly a number that staggers the imagination. And then the Prime Minister utters these significant comments. Says he, "The battle which has now begun will grow constantly in scale and in intensity for many weeks to come. I shall not speculate on its course, but this I may say. Complete unity prevails among the Allied armies. There is a brotherhood in arms between us and our friends of the United States." And then the Prime Minister makes the first report on the overall progress of the battle. There are already hopes that actual tactical surprises has been attained. Churchill says, "And we hope to furnish the enemy with a succession of surprises during the course of the fighting." And as the eyewitness accounts come back from the front, we get this picture of the Allied soldier.
This is the National Broadcasting Company. We take you now to London.
This is the Advanced Allied Command Post. American war correspondent Stanley Richardson has just returned from the second front beachhead with the first naval eyewitness of the operation. Mr. Richardson.
I've just returned from the Channel approaches to the coast of France, where I was privileged to watch the opening phases of the largest scale military invasion operation in history. My ringside seat was the heaving deck of a United States Naval Patrol torpedo boat, on which I traveled across the Channel with the first contingent of a naval task force. This force was composed mostly of American units. From the time we left the British coast until we were within a short 2 or 3 miles of the French shore, our naval units encountered no enemy opposition whatsoever. That, perhaps, is the outstanding fact that I brought back with me. Altogether, my squadron of PT boats was in the Channel for about 20 hours. We covered scores of square miles of rolling, choppy sea. We were patrolling and acting as escort for literally hundreds of slower-moving vessels of all descriptions. Many of them had been at sea longer than we had, but the Germans either were taken completely by surprise or just were afraid to come out and challenge us. Not a recognizable enemy plane appeared overhead. At least no bombs were dropped at or on any of the ships in our area. No low-flying fighters came over to strafe us with machine gun fire. And no enemy vessels, not even one of their vaunted E-boats, came out to the attack. The officers and men with whom I rode wondered searchingly about this. They had been keyed up for some real German opposition, both from the air and the sea. Their trigger fingers were itching for a scrap, and they were a very disappointed lot at not getting it. If the Germans weren't just too timid to come out, the only other ready explanation that could be advanced was that they were too busily engaged in coping with the Allied air attacks made on their shore establishments as a prelude to the actual landing of troops. In the area we covered, we could see hundreds of bombers and fighters shuttling back and forth, dropping their bomb loads and returning to England for more explosives to blast the enemy. And we could see the big two-engined American transport planes, also in the hundreds, returning to their bases in the United Kingdom after dropping their airborne troops in France. Yes, Jerry had a lot to keep him busy last night and early today, but as far as the naval phase of our activity was concerned, not a shot was exchanged with the enemy while I was on the scene. For that preliminary phase of the show, at any rate, it was all too incredibly easy. We left our patrol torpedo boat base in daylight to accompany the slower-moving light advance guard of ships, which had to pave the way for the actual landing. One of our missions was to protect the Allied minesweepers, which cleared a wide channel straight to the enemy shore for our troop transports and supply ships. Long lines of ships of every description were discernible on the skyline. Literally miles of craft in even column converging upon the area in the channel marked for the concentration point for the actual invasion. Huge transports, tank landing ships, smaller troop landing craft, tankers and supply vessels of every kind, plodded doggedly along under lowering skies and laboring over heavy seas. You people at home would have been thrilled to the bone to have seen all these American men, American ships, and American supplies sailing calmly into the action for which they had been prepared and trained for so many months. It was estimated that there were more than 4,000 ships of all kinds in the channel for this combined operation. By nightfall, we were nearing the French coast, and our watch tightened. But nothing happened. Even when a full, near moon, appearing fitfully from behind the clouds, gave our position away clearly to any enemy who may have been lying in wait for us. Then the fast and heavy combat ships moved up into position. All aligned themselves in the bombardment area to loose a hail of high explosives to protect the troops moving into the beaches on their landing craft. The warships started laying their smoke screen preparatory to shooting their guns. It was within only a few minutes of H hour of the long-awaited D-Day, and right there was where I got the biggest disappointment of my life. We turned around and headed back at high speed for the English coast. Our PT squadron was under orders to return to base and refuel for another mission as soon as its first operation was completed. So I didn't even hear the bombardment begin. But I can tell you that if things are going as well now as they looked to be going at the time I left the scene, it won't be long before our troops have a firm foothold. And now here's Merrill Muller at the advanced command post of the Allied forces.
This is Merrill Muller reporting from the Advanced Allied Command Post of the Invasion Forces. Operations toward the liberation of Europe commenced just a few hours ago. Thousands of ships, both in the air and on the sea, and armies of men are in motion fighting the greatest military amphibious undertaking in history. The whole thing started moving when one man pressed a theoretical button some hours ago. That man was the Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who thinks of himself modestly as a Kansas foreman. Every evening, General Eisenhower gathered his staff around him in his secret headquarters, studied their faces, and asked their opinions. A gale had already roughened the channel, but the staff was confident on the winds, tide, and weather of today, suiting an amphibious assault upon Europe. That was it. General Eisenhower wished his commanders luck, and the great undertaking then and there began to unfold. The finest collection of military minds in the United Nations had created a plan they considered complete. Every possible contingency had been thought of. A tremendous mass of the greatest military equipment ever devised had been pooled by the Allied attacking forces. For bombardment, the likes of which the world has never seen, was ready to open. Everything that could humanly be done had been done up to the point when General Ike pushed the button. The campaign thus passed to the direction of God and the hands of the common soldier. Early Monday morning, as the huge invasion force made last-minute preparations, General Eisenhower checked his decision again with his staff. The word was still go. Good weather was the prediction for H-hour D-Day. The dominating air support depends on good weather even more than the Allied navies. While landing craft of all types swung in and out of convoys to check their loadings and replace used fuel, General Eisenhower was busy doing the things he wanted to do, the only things he could do, visit his troops. As H-hour D-Day approaches, there is nothing more tactically useless than a supreme commander, except as an inspiration. General Ike is certainly that. I have never seen him more popular with his troops. I have never seen any commander receive greater acclaim or buoy his men more than does General Eisenhower. One British battalion cheered him as they clanked aboard their fast landing barge. He waved a friendly hello, and that broad grin lit up his face, a face that showed nothing but confidence in his men, a face in which fatigue is miraculously erased whenever it mirrors the Allied esprit de corps and the fighting spirit of the little men with rifle and bayonet. He came back from the port full of a sense of victory. No finer force ever went into battle with a better spirit or with greater courage than this one that General Eisenhower heads. In visiting with Royal and American Navy landing craft and with the Allied troops they will carry, the general had been given a lift. Some of his own nervous tension had been relieved. So he arrived at our hidden camp to meet the 4 correspondents attached to his staff. If I never attend another press conference in my life, I shall certainly remember this one. Perhaps because its outstanding factor was that it was more like a staff conference than a general's talk to newspapermen. Here's the picture. Remember that all around us, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of men were readying themselves for the outbreak of the battle that all the world had waited for 4 long, dark years.
Ladies and gentlemen, the prayer of the President of the United States. Almighty God, our sons, pride of our nation, this day have set upon a mighty endeavor, a struggle to preserve our republic, our religion, and our civilization, and to set free a suffering humanity. Lead them straight and true. Give strength to their arms, stoutness to their hearts, steadfastness to their faith. They will need thy blessings. Their road will be long and hard. The enemy is strong. He may hurl back our forces. success may not come with rushing speed, but we shall return again and again. And we know that by thy grace and by the righteousness of our cause, our sons will triumph. They will be sore tried by night and by day, without rest, till the victory is won. The darkness will be rent by noise and flame. Men's souls will be shaken with the violences of war. These are men lately drawn from the ways of peace. They fight not for the lust of conquest. They fight to end conquest. They fight to liberate. They fight to let justice arise, and tolerance and goodwill among all thy people. They yearn but for the end of battle, for their return to the haven of home. Some will never return. Embrace these, Father, and receive them, thy heroic servants, into thy kingdom. And for us at home, fathers, mothers, children, wives, sisters, and brothers of brave men overseas, whose thoughts and prayers are ever with them, help us, Almighty God, to rededicate ourselves in renewed faith in Thee in this hour of great sacrifice. Many people have urged that I call the nation into a single day of special prayer. But because the road is long and the desire is great, I ask that our people devote themselves in continuance of prayer. As we rise to each new day, and again, when each day is spent, let words of prayer be on our lips, invoking thy help to our efforts. Give us strength in our daily tasks, to redouble the contributions we make in the physical and material support of our armed forces. And let our hearts be stout to wait out the long travail, to bear sorrows that may come, to impart our courage unto our sons, wheresoever they may be. And, O Lord, give us faith. Give us faith in Thee, faith in our sons, faith in each other, faith in our united crusade. Let not the keenness of our spirit ever be dulled. Let not the impacts of temporary events, of temporal matters, of but fleeting moment, let not these deter us in our unconquerable purpose. with thy blessing, we shall prevail over the unholy forces of our enemies. Help us to conquer the apostles of greed and racial arrogances. Lead us to the saving of our country, and with our sister nations into a world unity that will spell sure peace, a peace invulnerable to the schemings of unworthy men, and a peace that will let all men live in freedom, reaping the just rewards of their honest toil. Thy will be done, Almighty God. Amen. That is the prayer in which the President of the United States has asked us to join him as he leads us at 10 o'clock this evening over the radio. And now a few news bulletins that have just come in. A bulletin from London. The Nazi-operated Vichy radio reported tonight that compact masses, that's in quotation marks, compact masses of Allied planes are bombing the Calais and Dunkirk regions of the French invasion coast. That's some 125 miles to the east of the landings made at Le Havre this morning. It means that our beachheads are expanding, that we are going to different portions of the coast. Dunkirk, of course, and Calais are nearest to the English coast. The German radio reports that Allied paratroopers have landed just across the channel from England, there in the Boulogne-Calais area, that those paratroopers have occupied an enemy airdrome there. If that is true, and there is no reason to believe the Germans would put out a false report of that nature, it means an Allied invasion thrust directly across the Strait of Dover, 100 miles or more above that Allied beachhead area on the Norman coast. We have no confirmation of any invasion activity in this area from Allied headquarters as yet. But already we are expanding our beachhead there in Normandy. And in Stockholm they're saying that Denmark has said today that German troops in the protectorate there have been ordered on an invasion alert since early this morning. And General Sir Bernard Montgomery says he is pleased with the initial phases of the invasion operations. General Montgomery heads the Allied armies taking part in the landings, as you know. Montgomery was quite happy as he told newsmen today that he'd given his officers a 5-point recipe for victory just before the invasion began. The 5-point recipe for victory, Montgomery said, was this: 1, Allied solidarity; 2, offensive eagerness; 3, enthusiasm; 4, confidence; and 5, all-out effort. That's General Montgomery's 5-point recipe for victory. And in Washington, Secretary of War Stimson, with smiles on his face, told the newsmen that first reports of the Allied landings in France indicated the long-awaited invasion was going very nicely. He's the second Washington official today to say that. Admiral King, Chief of our Navies, and a member of President Roosevelt's Strategic Board, said that when he left the President this morning. And we learn now that the Nazis are suppressing news of the progress of the invasion and withholding the facts from the German people. Radio Atlantic, which is a German secret transmitter, charged in a broadcast monitored this afternoon by NBC that the German propaganda machine was letting only a trickle of news out to the German people. What scant news is put out by the German home radio is very confused and depressing, and the people of Berlin have gathered in the streets in whispering knots, wondering where the next blow will fall. They know that by nightfall and the hours of darkness now ensuing will mean more landings. Where, they ask. Their prime question is where. The clandestine transmitter, located somewhere in Germany, states all this today. It is significant, says this radio station, which is called Anti-Nazi, that though broadcasts beamed to Germany from England repeat the German claims of successes in naval engagements in the Channel, the Reich radio has made no such statements. It has not claimed that Allied ships were sunk in the Channel. The German radio people know only too well the deplorable state of their fleet. They recall the sober statement of a high Nazi naval official that they are up against the strongest fleets in the world. And in Washington, Henri Opinot, the delegate of the French Committee of National Liberation, says that French divisions soon will participate in the Battle of France and that French shock troops will help to open the road to Paris, the road from Le Havre, we suppose. Side by side with American and British divisions, French divisions armed with the magnificent material given to them by the United States soon will participate in the battle. French soldiers will fight tomorrow as they have fought in Africa and in Italy, where by the side of the Allies they opened the road to Rome. Tomorrow they will open the road to Paris. And Prime Minister Winston Churchill received today this congratulatory message from Premier Stalin of Russia of the Allied liberation of Rome. He said, "I congratulate you on the great victory of the Allied Anglo-American forces in the taking of Rome." This news has been greeted in the Soviet Union with great satisfaction. Those are the words of Premier Stalin. And the Berlin radio reports tonight that big air battles have developed over Romania today between Nazi fighters and bombers of the Allied Mediterranean Air Force. Soon we may expect the Russians to be on the push there. This news is brought to you from the NBC newsroom in New York by your commentator, Don Goddard.
This is the National Broadcasting Company.
I was at this RAF tactical station a few hours ago. These pilots covered not only the actual invasion coast, but roads and railroads far behind what may be termed the front line. Except for one railroad train and scattered motor cars and trucks, there was no road transport to be seen in this entire region. I'm not basing my opinion merely on the strength of what a second party said. I actually talked to and sat in on the interrogations of each and every light bomber crew that returned. There's also a sneaking suspicion in my mind that the Germans were prepared for something entirely different. One, they may have expected the invasion in the Pas-de-Calais area. After all, that is the closest to the British Channel coast, and we've repeatedly bombed this area in recent weeks. I had an interesting talk with the group captain of this RAF tactical air base. He said that, costly though these diversionary raids may have been, they served their purpose in steering the Germans far wide of the true objective to be hit. In all this diversionary tactic, don't forget the complete disruption of bridge communications across the River Seine. Secondly, there is also a certain amount of substantiation for the belief that the Germans felt we were not quite prepared to attack at the present time. There is incontrovertible proof that the Germans have moved 600,000 motor vehicles to the Russian front in recent weeks. That doesn't sound much like they were contemplating an invasion in the strength of the present one. Figures may be misleading in an operation of this dimension, but let me give you a few which are reliable. We used between 3,000 to 5,000 landing craft and ships in this operation. The figure closer to 5,000 may be the more accurate. In the hours before H hour, the British, using an estimated 1,200 aircraft, dropped between 6,000 to 8,000 tons of bombs on the invasion coast. This means that each and every aircraft carried a maximum load. If I can judge by the bombing, briefing, which I attended in the hours just prior to H hour, I would hazard the guess that not one of these bombs was wasted. Not only was our offensive weapon keyed to its highest pitch, but similarly, our defensive weapons were no less formidable. For instance, you have undoubtedly heard of the Allied planes shot down by Allied ships and anti-aircraft in the invasion of Italy. General Eisenhower was quick to realize this potential danger. So, in the hours just before takeoff time, the wings and the bellies of all Allied craft, British as well as American, were painted with alternative black and white stripes. They were so visible even in darkness that many pilots from the RAF wing which I visited gave a start every time they turned their head sufficiently to see this new type of identification mark. But the heroes in this invasion are not only numbered among the airmen, nor are they solely the GI boys who had to go in and face everything which the Jerry had. GI Joe and all his buddies had to be landed at an exact spot on the Cherbourg coast in order to make the initial opening a successful one. So midget submarines, the type that went into the coast of Norway to plaster the German battleship Tirpitz, were called on to supply markers for the invasion barges. They left these friendly shores 3 days ago, creeping in by inches at times to gain admittance to what the Germans preferred to hold as verboten territory. But the submarines got through. Their markers were up, and the landing craft went in. One only needs talk with an initiated person to gain complete confidence in the operations just begun. I've done so. I know of the tremendous strength involved. I also know something of the potential strength of the Germans in the invasion territory. Since I have complete confidence in the authenticity of the picture painted for me, I also have complete confidence in the success of these operations. A glance into the London sky early this morning would have given each and every one of you that same confidence. We're on the march. We can only hope that the Germans are on the march backward.
You've just heard David Anderson. And now,
this is Ed Harker, just back from a flight over part of the battle area with the 9th Air Force. The invasion of continental Europe from the west, and we now know it's in full swing this morning, was undoubtedly the most closely guarded secret of this war. Part of the story can now be told from the correspondent's point of view. We all know how General Eisenhower, before the invasion of Sicily, took the war correspondents into his confidence, told them of his plans, even went so far as to give them a pretty good idea of when it would take place. Not so this time. If any correspondent was taken into the general's confidence, it would be a surprise indeed to some who have enjoyed this privilege in the past. During the last few weeks, as the world was forewarned, there have been feints. Correspondents, some of the best, were called by phone, told to report at a certain place, were then escorted to points far removed from London, were wined and dined in a manner of speaking, and then just as abruptly sent back to London. One group was kept out of circulation for 10 days. My own call came on Friday. It so happened I'd gone to the 9th Bomber Command to interview General Sam Anderson and one of his colonels. I'd had it as the RAF flyers express it. A call from London instructed the 9th Bomber Command to keep me. On Saturday to transfer me to a 9th Bomber Command station. But even then, I thought it was part of another feint. Or I should say I didn't till yesterday. Beginning in the early morning, command cars started to appear at the station, more than usual. The MPs, who usually ride around the station in a jeep, suddenly took to walking, and they were curious as to where I was going. In addition, the personnel, even including the correspondents, were told to remain. No moving off base at night for a few quick mild and bitters in the nearby pub. We were under lock and key, and it suddenly began to dawn on us that great events were in the offing. Our first official word that D-Day finally had arrived was given us at about 10 o'clock last night, British time. I sat in a small Nissen hut at the bomber station, just talking about friends back home, our families and children. The door opened and the base commander, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Seymour, came in. Be ready to fly in the morning, he said. Be ready to be briefed at such and such a time. That meant D-Day, of course. We had planned no operational flight other than the one for D-Day. Within a few hours, we'd washed and shaved, for what reason I don't know. We had had our snack at the officers' mess. Then to the briefing room, where Colonel Seymour stood waiting for his flyers to seat themselves. A large, brightly lighted Nissen hut covered with maps and charts of Hitler's Europe. Like the men who bomb and have been bombing Europe day after day, Seymour rarely puts on any display of dramatics. He said, "Now, fellows, this is what you've been waiting for." And his voice was no more dramatic than that. This, he said, is Invasion Day. And then he and his intelligence officers gave us the information we had been waiting to hear, where it was going to take place. For an hour and a half he briefed us, repeated time and time again the words that today's bombing had to be good, that men crossing the channel at that very moment were depending on it. He closed the briefing with 3 messages, one from General Anderson, one from Air Marshal Sir Trafford Lee Mallory, one finally from General Eisenhower. So it was at all the stations of the 9th Bomber Command early this morning, and in each case, It was followed by crews of men filing out into the moonlit night, each crew to its own marauder, parked in the diversion area. The name of the plane that took me to see the opening of this great invasion is Hoots Zooch Shooter. We took off before dawn. The rendezvous was about an hour off, someplace along the channel, possibly out in the channel, it doesn't matter. As we approached, so did many other planes, their silhouettes outlined by the full moon. And then as the dawn of a new day spread out over occupied Europe, the marauders pointed their noses toward the east, headed for their target on the French coast. Below, as my eyes got used to the light, I counted upwards of 60 invasion boats. There were more later, hundreds. Above, the skies were filled with an infinity of planes of all descriptions. Beyond, closer to the French coast, allied ships of war were blasting the targets along the invasion beaches. That was the picture as France loomed through the sun-beamed haze and clouds. And then shortly, too shortly in fact, we were over the coast, heading toward our target, only 3 minutes away. It was an effective bombing, I saw it. The smoke, flame, and dust testified to that. And then, sitting in the waist of that B-26, I saw the flak, light but strong, rise out around our formation. I had a sudden sensation of fear, and only after crossing the coast, headed back toward England, did I again regain my composure. Off to my left, a young bombardier sitting in the plexiglass office sat reading a newspaper. That helps, too. As for the battle itself, I certainly can't picture the turn of events from an eyewitness story from the waist of a B-26. But one thing for sure. While I saw some German planes go over Europe today, the mastery of the skies is ours. Your guess is as good as mine as to where the Luftwaffe is. But Prime Minister Churchill today, as it's already been pointed out, said 11,000 Allied planes are available. It's estimated 7,000 of these were used this morning, 5,000 bombers of all types and 2,000 fighters, or in fighter strength alone, equal to all those available to Germany.
You just heard the eyewitness reports of NBC's own staff correspondents, Wright Bryan, David Anderson, and Ed Hawker, all of whom have just returned from the front-line invasion area. This is John W. Vandercook returning you to the NBC newsroom in New York.
Thank you, Stanley Richardson, Merrill Muller, John Vandercook, David Anderson, Wright Bryan, and Ed Hawker for your on-the-spot reports of this great day. You have given us a well-rounded picture in these last 40 minutes of the diverse operations that we call invasion. And while you have been speaking, we have received a recording from Ralph Howard in Rome, the captured Italian capital. And we now bring you that recording.
This is Ralph Howard speaking from Rome. The opening of the second front on the northern coast of France is being announced to the people of Rome. And for the second day, the town is cheering and shouting in wild ecstasy. The first official announcement here in Rome was made over army loudspeakers in the Piazza Venezia, where thousands of persons were gathered. A tremendous cheer went up when the announcement was made in Italian, and American, British, and French soldiers in the vicinity were grabbed around the neck and kissed and hugged. Everyone wants to shake your hand, and it took me 10 minutes this morning to walk 4 blocks because of the many interruptions. Like yesterday, the main streets of Rome are packed with people. They don't seem to be going in any particular direction. They just want to be out and watch the long lines of jeeps and military vehicles move slowly through the streets. The feeling is electric, and the word of the Western invasion is spreading like wildfire. Small groups of people call to one another, spreading the news, and those first hearing of it immediately break into smiles and want to shake the hand of the nearest person. I've been able to talk with only a few American boys this morning about the Western invasion, but I believe their reaction is typical. Private Lionel Lear of Manchester, New Hampshire said, when our boys know that someone is pushing from the other side, it will help their morale 100%. There won't be any lag in the attending campaign now as far as the boys are concerned if they know that we really have the Jerry's on the run. Sergeant Belmont Fisher of New York City told me
We've been talking about the second front now for months. Everybody had bets down on when it would come, but even now it's a surprise, but a swell one. Now the boys will start betting on when the war will be over. One captain said that when his men heard the news this morning, a lot of them wanted to start an invasion of their own from the Rome area to the southern France. With Allied forces starting to bet on the date of the final victory, German troops are being pushed off to the Tiber River, and military commanders say that in many places the enemy is in general state of confusion. Official Nazi papers have been found recording the fact that desertions and self-inflicted wounds are increasing tremendously among the German troops. Excessive drinking has also increased. Complaints and disputed statements will be punished to prevent the degeneration of our forces and Nazi orders reached. It will be very interesting to watch the reaction of German forces here in Italy when they hear news of the westward invasion. From Rome, I return you now to the NBC newsroom in New York.
That was a recording by Ralph Howard from the newly captured city of Rome. Let me now summarize the invasion situation as it stands at this time, some 6 hours after we had the first news that it was underway. We have landed on 2 points of the Normandy coast between Cherbourg and Le Havre, and we have established ourselves on those beachheads successfully. From those 2 points, our troops have succeeded in marching inland. That is the test of a successful beachhead. The fact that the troops that have landed there can proceed from their original landing point and make their way inland. You will remember at Dieppe, we never succeeded in getting inland at all. We landed, but were forced to go back. Here, we have landed successfully. We have made landings at other points also, but so far as we know, we are marching inland from 2 points only. We have word that we have taken 2 Channel Islands, Guernsey and Jersey. They are important for later operations. The chances are that we will establish airfields there for further development of the operation. Marshal Pétain has just broadcast over the Nazi-controlled Paris radio, appealing to the French people not to aggravate our misfortunes by acts which would bring upon you tragic reprisals. The Marshal's voice has long ceased to have any power with the French people. The voice to which they listen today was that of General Eisenhower, telling them what lay ahead. We know that there has been a naval battle in the estuary of the Seine River. That naval battle, according to German reports, we have won. The Germans also tell us that there is heavy fighting at Caen. That is a matter of 20-odd miles inland in Normandy. It is an important railroad center where our paratroops landed and where they are now defending the points which they seized. London tells us that German destroyers and E-boats, that's motor torpedo boats, were reported to be entering the Allied operational area off the coast of France. That means that we are following up this initial success in the Seine estuary. There was a heavy bombardment of the British Channel coast across the Straits of Dover. That bombardment lasted for 45 minutes. Immediately after it began, Allied bombers escorted by fighters took off from British bases and winged their way across. And within a few minutes after their arrival over French soil, the bombardment ceased. There is every indication that everywhere along the French coast we met less opposition than we had expected. The obstacles encountered were less severe than we had supposed. The initial landings have been successfully completed. We have landed at least 60,000 paratroopers, British and American, at various points in Normandy. Undoubtedly, according to what we have heard so far, they are holding their positions. The initial phase of the invasion has been successful. That, of course, is the initial stage. The Germans will now bring up reinforcements, and the real struggle will begin. But every Allied leader is satisfied with the progress made so far.
The National Broadcasting Company, continuing our complete coverage of the invasion news, takes you now to the NBC newsroom in Washington.
And this is Richard Harkness in our nation's capital. If I had only one word to describe Washington this historic D-Day morning, that word would be that our nation's capital is confident. There is a feeling here that now the invasion is underway, it will succeed. But before the day is out, we undoubtedly will have some word direct from President Roosevelt. The President is scheduled to hold his regular press and radio conference this afternoon at 4 o'clock, and, of course, Mr. Roosevelt will undoubtedly comment on the progress of the invasion. Well, certainly that word, confident, describes the mood of President Roosevelt last night, only a few hours before our invasion of Hitler's Fortress Europe was formally announced. As you know, Mr. Roosevelt broadcast last night on the liberation of Rome. Well, as Commander-in-Chief, the President certainly knew what was coming in Europe before the night was over. But as he sat in the White House waiting to broadcast, he gave no hint to the little personal crowd which jammed into his broadcasting room. Mr. Roosevelt was surrounded by his family. Mrs. Roosevelt is in Washington, and so are the President's two grandchildren, Sisty and Buzzy, his daughter, Mrs. Anna Bodiger, and his son-in-law, Major John Bodiger. Well, the President was in an unusually good humor. He joked with the network announcers and engineers. The President drew a big laugh when he threatened to mention Anthony Muto, Tony Muto, a newsreel man of Italian descent, along with Christopher Columbus, Marconi, and other prominent Italians who have contributed to world progress. So the President, obviously, was confident of the outcome of this mighty Allied invasion. He even slept through the early hours of the attack. Well, another person who knew what was coming was General George C. Marshall, the Chief of Staff. Well, General Marshall was the honored guest last evening at the Russian Embassy, where he received one of the highest military decorations the Soviet can give. Well, it can be told now that the general puzzled an imposing list of dignitaries when he declined to wait for the customary buffet supper, which incidentally is very good at the Russian Embassy. But the answer came within a few hours when General Eisenhower's headquarters announced the invasion, and now everyone knows why General Marshall went home early last night. Then Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson set an example of confidence. He stayed at home during the small hours of the morning when the news was being flashed all over the world. As you recall, Mr. Stimson had told a news conference days ago that we won't start the invasion until we are sure of its success. Well, meanwhile, the House will meet at 11 o'clock Eastern Wartime this morning to consider the Price Control Extension Bill, and the Senate will meet at noon to work on the same subject. But it is quite likely that most of our representatives, our senators too, will spend their time in the cloakrooms with their ears glued to the radio for the latest invasion bulletins. Well, Washington, of course, is an international city. There is a little bit of England here at the British Embassy. There's a little bit of France, for instance, at the French legation. The British ambassador, the tall, gaunt Lord Halifax, is the first diplomat to make a direct statement on the invasion. Lord Halifax says that he has no doubt that we will have very tough fighting on the continent of Europe. But Lord Halifax goes on to say that we all have complete confidence in General Eisenhower, complete confidence in his deputy commanders, and complete confidence in all our Allied troops. Well, that statement of Lord Halifax seems to summarize, perhaps better than any other statement, the way Washington feels about this invasion. Complete confidence in the men who are doing the fighting, and complete confidence in the men who are in our high command. Well, as a city, Washington is taking the invasion calmly. The nightclubs and cocktail lounges still were packed when the German radio proclaimed the invasion at 12:37 Eastern Wartime this morning. But the city had been fooled by that Associated Press flash for 2 brief minutes last Saturday, so this time Washington was a little blasé about it. Then, of course, when Allied confirmation came at 3:32 a.m., most of the people were in bed. However, a list of Washington dignitaries had asked the NBC newsroom some weeks ago to call them at any hour when the invasion comes. So about 4 o'clock this morning, we of NBC here routed out, for instance, Dr. Alexander Loudon, the ambassador from the Netherlands. And we awakened Senator Barkley, the majority leader of the Senate from Kentucky. We routed out Speaker Sam Rayburn of Texas, and then Representative Joe Martin, who is the minority leader. And then when the Capitol awakened this morning, there was little evidence of real excitement. People jammed their way onto Washington's overcrowded streetcars and buses and went to work as usual. So far here in Washington, there have been no whistles or no ringing of bells. It's just another workaday Tuesday in this world's biggest business, which is the United States government. However, news dealers on the downtown corners report that their sale of newspapers has been fairly brisk so far. And I noticed that people having their orange juice, toast, and coffee in downtown restaurants this morning all had their noses buried in the newspapers or were cocking an ear for radios, which do seem to be going full blast all over town. Well, among the street crowds here in Washington, reaction is slow. A streetcar motorman, alluding to the Associated Press's false invasion announcement Saturday, said, "I heard another announcement a couple of days ago, and I want to wait and see on this one." However, there is an air of grimness here. A large group gathered at St. John's, the Church of the Presidents, and special D-Day prayers were read this morning. Well, as this business goes on as usual here in Washington, it is all connected, of course, with the war. For instance, Leo T. Crowley, our foreign economic administrator, says that he is leaving soon for Italy to make a personal inspection of the relief problems brought up by our liberation of Rome. Then on Capitol Hill, reaction to the invasion is one of prayer for the success of our American and our British soldiers. Meanwhile, referring to another phase of the war, Senator Homer Ferguson, a Republican from Michigan, announces that he will demand a congressional investigation into the Pearl Harbor tragedy. The House is scheduled to vote on a resolution extending the time for trial of the Pearl Harbor commander. And then another story here, which on a normal day would be a front page, top headline story. The Special House Committee is planning to hear this morning Montgomery Ward Chairman Sewell Avery testify in its probe of seizure of the mail order firm by the United States Army. Well, one of the civilians largely responsible for the success of this invasion mounted today is Mr. Donald M. Nelson, the chairman of the War Production Board. Well, the invasion itself found Nelson outside of Washington and typically found him at work spurring the country to new production records. Nelson is in Detroit, and in this big war center, his schedule today calls for conferences to try to iron out some of Detroit's strike troubles. Nelson was informed of the invasion during the early morning hours, but he had no comment to offer. Yesterday, you'll remember, the War Production Board chairman delivered a rather scathing rebuke to both management and labor for industrial unrest as the invasion hour approached. And today, it's expected that Mr. Nelson will undoubtedly elaborate on his statement. So, if I may summarize, Washington is taking the invasion in its stride with an air of calm confidence.
You have just heard Richard Harkness speaking from Washington. Now, NBC continues its coverage of the invasion as we return you to the NBC newsroom in New York.
Here we are back in the NBC newsroom in New York, and coming toward the microphone at this time to give you more of the last-minute flashes as they're coming over the wire is Robert St. John.
Here's one from London, which quotes the German DNB agency as broadcasting a report that Allied tanks have penetrated several kilometers into France. That looks as if we are deepening our bridgehead, as if we have begun to go places in France. And here's one that quotes the German Transocean Agency as broadcasting the claim that almost 80 medium-sized warships are approaching our beachhead in France. Now, that bulletin doesn't say what kind of warships they are. I assume they are Allied warships. And here's another bulletin from a U.S. fighter base in England, which says that Thunderbolt pilots returning from the invasion area today reported that Allied troops are piling onto the shore of France virtually with no opposition, and that the skies are practically clear of German planes. And now here's another bulletin. Just a second, here's one more bulletin. Here we are. Another bulletin that says big guns on the French coast opened fire across the Strait of Dover shortly after midday today. A salvo of 4 shells was seen to explode. And here's another one. The German Transocean News Agency says that Allied paratroopers have landed on the islands of Jersey and Guernsey west of the Norman Peninsula. And here's another one. The German High Command, in its first invasion communique, today said Allied forces suffered very heavy reverses in the Caen area of northern France, and it claimed that an entire regiment of paratroopers was destroyed in that sector.
Now, first, let's go over the chronology a little bit. We've been on the air all night here at Columbia's news headquarters in New York. We started at 12:37 Eastern War Time when the German news agency Transocean broadcast that the Allied invasion had begun. That is 37 minutes past midnight, New York time, and that's when we began our broadcasts. We came on the air about every 15 minutes, as I recall. It seems like a long time ago at that point, giving you the stories which were coming out of Europe very slowly, all put out by the Germans. And we continued our programs and continued to not interrupt our regular programs, but we continued to come on about every 15 minutes or half hour with a news broadcast. Then at 3 o'clock in the morning, New York time, we started this particular broadcast, which has never stopped, because 32 minutes after we started it, and we're still discussing the reports which were coming out of Germany, suddenly we got the word to switch to London. Colonel Dupuy of the United States Army read communique number 1, and the invasion had begun officially. Now, let's go over this chronology just a little bit. I'm sure that while a number of you must have been with us all night on this broadcast, still there are others who are now getting up and who are joining us and who perhaps haven't heard that the invasion has begun. The liberation of the continent of Europe has started. So let's go over the chronology briefly. At 12:37 in the morning, 37 minutes past midnight Eastern War Time, Transocean, a German news agency, broadcast the Allied invasion had begun. At 1 o'clock in the morning, Eastern War Time, the DNB agency broadcast that the French harbor, or port rather, the French port of Le Havre was being bombarded violently, and that German naval craft were fighting Allied landing craft off the coast. Nearly an hour later, at 1:56 in the morning, all times Eastern War Time, Calais radio, controlled by the Germans, Calais radio said, "This is D-Day." At 2:31 in the morning, a spokesman from General Eisenhower broadcast from London to warn the people of the European invasion coast that a new phase of the Allied air offensive had begun and ordered them to move 22 miles inland. We still didn't know that the invasion had begun. The Germans were saying so, but the spokesman from General Eisenhower's headquarters in London at that time, at 2:31, said to the people of Europe, a new phase of the Allied air offensive has begun. Move 22 miles away from the coast. At 3:29 in the morning, Eastern War Time, Berlin radio said the first center of gravity is Caen, that is C-A-E-N, the big city at the base of the Normandy Peninsula. And then, 3 minutes later, at 3:32 in the morning, Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force announced the communique number 1 in one sentence: Allied armies have begun landing on the northern coast of France. That was followed 8 minutes later at 3:40 by the announcement from Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force that General Sir Bernard Montgomery was in command of the assault army comprising Americans, British, and Canadians. That's a bit of the chronology so far. It's very sketchy. A bulletin has just been handed me, so I'll give you that at the moment. It comes from SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, just announces that United States battleships are supporting the Allied landings in France, and United States Coast Guard units also are participating in the operations. American Marines are in the fighting and are manning secondary guns aboard the big ships. We've been getting some reports, people pick up reports from the German radio and pass them along, and we give them to you for what they're worth. This one is certainly not like that. This is a statement from Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force. It's very late, so I'll repeat it for you. SHAEF has just announced that United States battleships are supporting the Allied landings in France, and United States Coast Guard units are participating in the operations. And American Marines are in the fighting also and are manning secondary guns aboard the big ships. Here's a statement from General Pershing, who commanded American armies in France in the First World War. General Pershing in Washington said, and this is a quotation from here on, "American troops have landed in Western Europe. As the overmastering military might of the Allies advances, it will be joined by the men of the occupied countries, whose land has been overrun by the enemy, but whose spirit remains unconquered." 26 years ago, American soldiers, in cooperation with their allies, were locked in mortal combat with the German enemy. Their march of victory was never halted until the enemy laid down his arms in defeat. This is what General Pershing says, and I continue. The American soldier of 1917 to 1918, fighting in a war of liberation, wrote by his deeds one of the most glorious pages of military history. Today, the sons of American soldiers of 1917, 1918 are engaged in a like war of liberation. It is their task to bring freedom to peoples who have been enslaved. And General Pershing finished his statement by saying, "I have every confidence that they, together with their gallant brothers in arms, will win through to victory." And that's the statement which General John J. Pershing, the commander of the American armies in France in the First World War, has issued in Washington. It's interesting to note one thing in particular in General Pershing's statement. He specifically points out that the march of the Allied troops to victory in 1918 was not halted until the German army laid down its arms in defeat. You know that Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party, when they came to power in Germany and even before, one of their main points of propaganda was that the German army had never been defeated, but that the German home front had betrayed the army in 1918 by quitting the war while the army still wanted to fight. In this statement from General Pershing in Washington, D.C., General Pershing takes the trouble to point out once again that Adolf Hitler was not telling the truth and that the German army was certainly defeated in 1918, laid down its arms willingly, and quit the fight. It's interesting to notice also that in a speech we've been monitoring the BBC overseas broadcast and understand they have a program on the air, and so for that we take you now quickly to London.
These 26 words. Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France. It was announced soon after this communiqué that General Montgomery was in charge of the Army group carrying out the assault. This Army group includes British, Canadian, and United States forces. Correspondents at Supreme Headquarters say the landings were in Normandy, and they took place between 6 o'clock and 8:15. Airborne landings have also been carried out in addition to those made from the sea. Minesweepers swept away into the coast. Battleships, monitors, and cruisers carried out long-range bombardments of German coastal defense batteries, while destroyers and special coastal forces of the landing craft type bombarded the batteries and beach defenses from nearer the shore. Both the Royal Navy and the United States Navy supplied the landing craft. About half the smaller types of the British landing craft were manned and commanded by men of the Royal Marines, and some of the infantry carrying ships through the Red Ensign of the British Merchant Navy. Correspondents at Supreme Headquarters say the naval aspect of the operation is predominantly British. Of the normal types of warships employed, the proportion is about 3 British to 1 American. The overall proportion, including landing craft, is about 3 British ships to 2 American ships. American battleships and United States naval aircraft are taking part. Transport routes across northern France were pounded throughout the night. Dutch Mitchells and Royal Air Force, Polish and Australian Mosquitoes of the RAF 2nd Tactical Air Force concentrated their attacks on roads, railways, and bridges, embankments, cuttings, and junctions, and other points in the transport network over a huge area where traffic blocks would be a nuisance to the enemy. There was a large amount of cloud over France, and a number of the Mitchells came back without bombing. The Mosquitoes nearly all found their targets, and pilots reported successful attacks on a convoy, rail and road junctions, and parked vehicles. RAF Bostons were engaged in smoke-laying operations in the English Channel. Observers on the coast say that activity during the night was on an unprecedented scale, and here in London there was a constant stream of aircraft overhead. The offensive has continued since dawn, and people on the coast have seen particularly strong formations of fighters flying out towards Dieppe. Strong forces of bombers are also reported to have crossed the east coast this morning, and there was great fighter activity. The German Overseas News Agency has been issuing frequent reports about the Allied landings. These say that the combined landing operations encompass the entire coastal sector between Le Havre and Cherbourg, that reinforcements were landed at dawn, and that several battleships are shelling the shore to cover waves of landing craft. Berlin reports that the area of Caen appears to be the first focal point in the fighting, and that in this area, German troops are in fierce combat with British and American units landed from the air and the sea. Caen, capital of the Department of Calvados, stands on the River Orne, about 10 miles inland behind the flat coast. His Majesty the King will broadcast this evening at 19 hours Greenwich Mean Time, that is at 9 p.m. double British summer time. General de Gaulle has arrived in England. He will broadcast a message to the French people later today. That is the end of this news bulletin from the BBC, London.
This is London calling.
Back again at Columbia's news headquarters in New York. We were just going along filling you in with the special reference to you of our audience who have just joined us, who have not heard about the invasion, who are just turning on your radios this morning. We were just going along, as I say, filling you in when we got quick word that the BBC was putting on a British news broadcast which might be of interest to you, and so we made a very rapid switch. My eye fell on the word speech in something that I was just about to give you, and that's why I said speech instead of switch. What I was saying before we did bring in the BBC was that it's interesting to see that in a speech which made no reference to invasion, but was delivered in the certain knowledge that the hour of climax finally had come, the President of the United States last night told the nation that victory over Germany is certain, but, he said, quote, it will be tough and it will be costly. To many radio listeners here in the United States last night, it seemed that President Roosevelt was extraordinarily preoccupied, and that his comment on the accomplishments in Italy was designed more to point them up as a prelude to what was to come than to extol the victory already won in Italy. Having in mind the fact that Berlin and Tokyo remain as Axis capitals, he summed up the capture of the Italian capital of Rome by saying, 1 up and 2 to go. A great many of you undoubtedly heard the speech of the president last night. Incidentally, that reference in the dispatch from Washington I was just giving you to Tokyo reminds me that before we realized that the invasion actually had begun, before the official word came from the Allied headquarters in England, when we were broadcasting here last night the German reports, one bit of copy came over the United Press wires. I was reading it right off the machine to you, saying, San Francisco, the Tokyo radio has said nothing at all about the German reports of invasion. That was the first and last time that the capital of Japan was heard from during this somewhat confused evening of broadcasting. And as it happened a long time ago, about 2:30 in the morning Eastern Wartime, I thought I might bring it up once again. Tokyo at that time said nothing. Tokyo has still said nothing as far as I know. If we do get word that the Japanese have made some comment upon the beginning of the liberation of the continent of Europe, we shall certainly pass it along to you as quickly as we can get it. Now, I hope that the broadcasts will not sound too repetitious from about this point on. We've had a very busy night of broadcasting. Everything was, as soon as we started in our New York headquarters, we were interrupted frequently because we had word that something was coming from England which we could bring you directly, and so we were going along pretty rapidly. But now our audience is being augmented constantly by people who are waking up to start the day and who have not heard all the news, and so from time to time, as we stay on the air here at Columbia's News headquarters in New York, we shall be repeating the most important details to fill in those people, those of our audience who are just coming in and who don't know what has happened. Perhaps you missed the first two official documents announcing officially the start of the Allied invasion of France. The first communique was one sentence long. It said, "Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France." That was the text of communique number one. It was read at Supreme Headquarters in England by the United States Army's Colonel Dupuy, and we carried the broadcast of Colonel Dupuy's reading that communique at 3:32 in the morning New York time. Moments later, it was announced from Great Britain that the British General Sir Bernard Montgomery is in charge of the attack. Perhaps you missed also General Eisenhower's order of the day. That was the next broadcast we got from London soon after the communique. Edward R. Murrow, Columbia's chief correspondent in Great Britain, read the text of General Eisenhower's order of the day. Here are some excerpts from that order. General Eisenhower said, "Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon a great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you, and the hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well trained, and he will fight savagely. But," the order from General Eisenhower ended, "the tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together, and we shall accept nothing less than full victory." And that, in brief, is the order of the day which General Eisenhower issued to his troops and which was broadcast shortly after communique number one. We have not had communique number two, incidentally. Communique number one, that one-sentence communique, is the only real official statement of the fighting that has come from the headquarters so far from Great Britain. Of course, we've had further details, but only the one communique. We heard, you know, that United States battleships are taking part in are part of the naval force, and also United States Coast Guard units are there taking part in the landings somewhere on the coast of northern France. And we heard also that American Marines are in the fighting and are manning secondary guns aboard the big ships. A few moments ago, in the BBC News broadcast, perhaps you heard the British announcer giving you a few further details. He mentioned the American forces who were there and also told us something about the Royal Marines of Great Britain and the ships flying the Red Duster, the Red Ensign, which means that they're British merchant ships who are also taking part in the landing operations. Now, at this point, 11 minutes past 6 o'clock in the morning, Eastern Wartime in New York, Major George Fielding Elliott, Columbia's military analyst, has come back into our studio. He has some more military news for us, and so I now hand the microphone over to Major Elliott.
We've just had a story which has come in on the wire from Washington by Sander S. Klein, United Press staff correspondent, and it tells of an American sergeant packing concentrated destruction who peered into the darkness toward France and said, "They can't stop us." His 4 words from an invasion front dispatched to the War Department were uttered as the greatest military operation of history began, very quietly and without tension, from a small British town whose inhabitants had little idea that anything unusual was going on. From this town, the War Department dispatch said, the liberation of Nazi Europe began in a small way as assault troops, relieved of practically everything but weapons, walked calmly aboard their blunt-nosed landing craft without attracting the slightest bit of attention. Of course, when they say began in a small way, the dispatch means that these were the first small assault detachments that are going ashore to clear the way for the larger forces that are coming behind. This is not a small operation, but it emphasizes the fact that the first detachments that go ashore are not very large ones and have to be built up into the great armies that will presently sweep forward into Europe. Thus started what in a matter of hours became a roaring, flaming, crashing inferno, the War Department dispatch continues, as the battle was joined on the northern coast of France and Allied airplanes swarmed against any targets, however small, which might have a bearing on the strength of the armies. The men had been briefed carefully. They knew exactly what their mission was. At the last moment, the War Department dispatch said they were relieved of practically everything except their arms and ammunition. An officer explained to them, "You are going to have a nice holiday by the seaside. You won't have any KP or fatigue details or training or anything. Just relax." A headquarters report described each man as a walking arsenal. Some carried their Garand rifles, 80 rounds of ammunition, and 3 grenades. Others bore grenade-launching Springfields, and others had Browning automatic rifles, the faithful old weapon of the last war, which is still doing excellent service in this one. Then there were bazookas and flamethrowers, TNT pole charges, and all the other equipment necessary to reduce fortified positions. The sergeant who said, "They can't stop us," added, "We've got more firepower than anybody ever heard of before." Another sergeant thought it was a pity that they should take away the men's overcoats before the last minute. On reflection, he added, "Maybe this is the last minute." It was. The men were equipped with other things besides their weapons. They had been taught, for example, to say in German, "Halt, put up your hands." And in French, "Which way is the Boche?" The assault units were assembled, not in divisions, regiments, battalions, or any of the other large military units, but in craft loads. Before the landing, these craft loads were assembled so that the men would drive on the beaches in their normal tactical formations. For the first day of operations, each soldier was issued 1 day emergency ration. Tomorrow, the War Department said, they will be served hot food from field kitchens in France. And as an old soldier, I can tell you that means a lot of very careful planning by the staff departments, the supply people who must be behind and who must take care of the troops all the way forward. And if they don't do their job, the troops are in a serious spot. But this has one of these operations which has all the earmarks of the most careful and thorough planning, and we can be very sure that those boys are going to get that hot food just as it has been promised to them. For a week before the invasion, the troops had been kept close to quarters in the marshalling towns, forbidden to talk to civilians or to any soldiers who were as yet unbriefed. When the time came to jump off, they were ready. Overhead streamed warplanes covering the operation. Targets for the 9th Air Force's Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and Lightnings, the War Department dispatch goes on, were concentrated in a relatively narrow but important urban area of northern France and Belgium, crisscrossed with roads and rail lines from Germany, leading to the first line of pillboxes and trenches dotted with strategic air bases and cities. No target is too small, the dispatch said. Still employing the present tense, the headquarters report added that the 9th Air Force is now flying more fighter-bomber missions with more aircraft than any Air Force in history. And thus, that useful plane, the fighter-bomber, a plane of all work of the Tactical Air Force, is again in operation, doing its work, supporting the ground troops, knocking out enemy resistance, blasting enemy columns as they move on the road, stopping a movement of enemy reserves as they come up to attack our men, and in general providing that invaluable cover to our ground forces, which is the Air Force's main task in supporting the first waves of an invasion. While these small units are still fighting their way ashore, while they're still likely to be outnumbered at a particular point by enemy ground troops, it is the job of the Air Force to cover them and protect them and to give them that support without which they could not hope to accomplish their mission. And now, here once again is Bob Trout.
We've been listening to Columbia's military analyst, Major George Fielding Elliott. broadcasting from our Columbia News headquarters here in New York City. The morning is very bright now in New York. It's only 17 minutes past 6 in New York, Eastern War time, but the morning does seem to be well advanced. The sun is high in the sky, and while speaking about New York's waking up, you will probably want to know how New York's famous Times Square reacted to the news that the invasion has at last begun, the news which came in the middle of last night and which we have been broadcasting constantly since it did come in. The news of the invasion was received with calm in Times Square. There were relatively few people, mostly a few servicemen, on the streets at that early hour. Here and there, groups of servicemen and civilians collected around taxi cabs and listened to radio reports of the landings on the coast of France. There were no demonstrations at all. About 25 persons gathered in front of a newsreel theater on Broadway at 4 o'clock in the morning when a radio loudspeaker blared forth the latest bulletins, and for all we know, perhaps that loudspeaker is blaring forth my voice at this moment. In other parts of the city, householders were up and at their radios. We could see scattered lights in apartment houses from out of the Columbia windows here in our news headquarters, and watchers, I might say, along Upper Broadway reported that scattered lights were seen all over town. At the Bendix Aviation Corporation Marine Division plant in Brooklyn, 500 swing shift workers gave a spontaneous cheer when the news was received, but the management said the workers remained at their jobs and not a second was lost. A scene that was probably typical of that in many public places here in New York was enacted at an East Side restaurant where about 20 diners rose and listened with bowed heads as the first reports were broadcast on the radio in the restaurant. Mayor F.H. LaGuardia of New York was told of the invasion by police, and he called upon the people of the city to carry on at their jobs, to give the men in the invasion forces their utmost support. Mayor LaGuardia announced plans for a mass prayer meeting at 5:30 p.m. Eastern War Time in Madison Square, where the Eternal Light, a memorial for the soldiers of the First World War, is burning. Police here in New York said that along Broadway, excitement aroused by the Allied announcement of the invasion had been somewhat tempered by the previous German reports which spread through the nightclub belt shortly after midnight. As a matter of fact, I came down to Columbia's news headquarters here in New York about 1:30 in the morning, New York time, in a taxi cab. The taxi cab driver told me that the Germans had broadcast that the invasion had started, but he advised me not to believe it until there was confirmation or some sort of word from the Allied headquarters. He said that the Germans were saying there was an invasion, but that didn't mean there was, and that was a very good attitude, I thought. It's one which we can all be proud of, because we were being very cautious here at Columbia and in all American newsrooms until the word came from SHAEF, from Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force in Great Britain. As long as it was just a matter of the Germans saying the invasion had begun, we were being very careful indeed. But this time, it was true. Most of the churches throughout the city of New York will be open today for special D-Day services. All Episcopal churches will be open, we've been informed, and at Trinity Church, the famous church in Manhattan, observances will be held every hour around the clock all through the day. And a number of war plants in this New York area will also hold special prayer services. That's the way New York took the news of the invasion. That's the way New York has taken it up to this moment. At about 21 minutes past 6 o'clock in the morning, New York time, there'll be further reports of how New York received the news as the city wakes up, and there will undoubtedly be further reports which we shall give you from other cities and places in the country, telling us how the rest of the United States received the news that at last the liberation of the continent of Europe has started. Here's an Associated Press dispatch which has just come in. It's from Wes Gallagher, and he datelines it, Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force. We might as well get used to the word SHAEF. The AP dispatch from Wes Gallagher says, in this military Shangri-La, cleverly hidden from snooping German spy planes, the war's greatest secret was hatched early this year. Adolf Hitler would have squandered the lives of 10 divisions and much of his wealth to have learned this secret even up to a few hours ago. But today he was given it free of charge, and it may cost him his life and power eventually. The secret, of course, was D-Day H-Hour. D-Day, as you probably all know by now, was the military terminology for the day of the great Allied attack. and D-Day was Monday. H hour was the exact hour British, Canadian, and American soldiers were expected to set foot on the soil of Western Europe. Hard supply necessities and the complications of modern amphibious warfare made it necessary that these two factors be known to the staff officers months in advance. The dates were set for the arrival of troops, guns, and tanks in Great Britain, the dates for air attacks on specific objectives, dates for establishing bases, dates for the capture of key ports. And Mr. Gallagher reminds us in his Associated Press dispatch that dates are not figures on the calendar. They're scheduled in terminology that goes like this: D+5 or D-6. The first means 5 days after the troops land. The second means 6 days before the day for attack. Hundreds of thousands of lives depended on a successful D-Day choice, and if the weather was bad and the water rough, thousands of soldiers might be drowned in the treacherous surfs of the European coast. If it was too light at night, the convoys might be broken up and the soldiers landed on the wrong beaches. And Mr. Gallagher's dispatch ends: if the tides were wrong, the ships might be stranded, or any one of 100 things might go amiss if the date had not been figured out very carefully in advance. And now we've just had word that we're to hear further news direct from overseas, and so for another report of the pool broadcasts, we take you now to London for the report of CBS correspondent Charles Shaw. Go ahead, London.
This is Charles Shaw in London. For an hour after the broadcast of Communique Number 1, I played town crier to a London generally unaware that France had been invaded. I rode and walked through the Strand, Fleet Street, past St. Paul's, along the Thames Embankment to the Houses of Parliament and Westminster Abbey, up to Piccadilly Circus and other parts of so-called downtown London, asking people here and there what they thought of the news. In most cases, I found out that I had to report the news before getting any comment. It looked like London any morning between 9:30 and 10:30. The streets comparatively deserted, soldiers of all nations ambling about, street cleaners running their brushes along the curbs. I asked a taxi driver to take me around the city because I wanted to see how people were reacting to the news. Incidentally, I asked him, "Have you heard the news?" "I heard something about it," he said, "but I don't know whether it's official." I assured him it was, because I had just returned from the studio where the communique was broadcast. Waiting for a traffic light, we drew alongside a car driven by a girl wearing the uniform of France. I leaned out and said, "What do you think of the news?" "What news?" she asked. "The Allies have landed in France." All she said was, "Thank God." Fleet Street, headquarters of the press in London, was normal. A couple of men who might have been reporters were seen dashing into buildings. And up to St. Paul's Cathedral to see whether there were worshippers inside. And the only person in the vast auditorium was a black-robed guide to the crypt who hadn't heard the news. His comment after being informed was, "That's good." And so it was all over London. 2 RAF sergeants were sightseeing in Westminster Abbey. A couple of women were trying unsuccessfully to gain entrance to the Houses of Parliament. Downing Street was empty, except for a street cleaner almost in front of number 10. All over London, women were selling flags for the benefit of the Red Cross. The girl I patronized hadn't heard the news, and her expression changed little when she was informed. The next interviewee was a roly-poly woman, just about as broad as she was long, who had heard the broadcast. "It's good," she said. Not a newspaper extra appeared on the street. London this morning, for at least an hour after the broadcast of Communique Number 1, was the same London that it was yesterday morning. Earlier this morning, the telephone rang at 7 a.m. It was Ed Murrow. He said, "Better get dressed and wait for a call from me." A new world speed record for getting dressed was promptly set. The dressing was accomplished against the background of heavy sky noise, the sound of great fleets of planes. They were too high to be seen, but their roar seemed to fill the sky, and the planes seemed to be everywhere. At 7:45, the phone rang again. Get to such and such a building as quickly as possible. It was the building from which the big communique was to be issued. It was going to work time for London, and masses of shop girls and businessmen jammed the sidewalks leading to that building. Almost bursting with what I felt was the big secret, I studied the faces of those people. Their expressions were the same as those of going-to-work people all over the world. Most of them looked sleepy. Quite a few of the girls were white-lipped, apparently having got up too late to put on lipstick and intending to do so at their offices. Some were neatly dressed, others had ties askew, just like the 8 o'clock crowd in Pittsburgh or San Francisco. But there was one difference. The clothes they wore neatly or carelessly were mostly of 1939 and 1940 vintage. The lipstick the girls wore or forgot to wear was of a hard, chalky substance, war stuff. The tiredness in their faces came not from a bad night, but from almost 5 years of working in the front lines of war. You felt like shouting to those weary people, "It's happened. The invasion has started." Because that's what these people have been working and fighting for. Fighting beside anti-aircraft guns, fighting with fire hoses, fighting with industrial tools, since one day almost exactly 4 years ago, when the tattered fugitives from Dunkirk reached these shores. In a few hours, they would know, and you wondered how they would take it. The building was reached, and the way correspondents were converging on the gates from all directions reminded you of the old Toonerville Trolley animated cartoons, in which an incomprehensible number of people would enter small apertures. They were all hurrying. Some of them just moved their legs faster without seeming to cover much more ground. Practically every pass that you'd been issued since arriving in London had to be produced. No one-eyed Connollys could get in here. Bureau chiefs were herded into one big room. One person from each press association, major newspaper, and broadcasting network. All others were barred. And downstairs, outside of news special studios, the other broadcasters were waiting and typing out last-minute pieces. And one of those studios had been locked tightly since its construction was completed. That was the studio from which the communique was to be read to a waiting world. Already, the German radio was broadcasting reports of fighting in France. London was maintaining silence. The broadcaster's workroom was filling with colonels, majors, lieutenants, and GIs of both the American and British armies. Nobody seemed quite sure of what so many soldiers were supposed to do in so small a room. White-legginged, white-belted MPs, their garrison caps banded with what looked like white bandages, took stations inside and outside the doors. In came the official Allied spokesman with retinue. He began calling New York network headquarters, informing them that the first communique would be broadcast at 9:32 London time. 9:32 arrived. The communique was broadcast. The big secret was out. This is Charles Shaw in London, returning you to New York.
Columbia's news headquarters in New York once again. Bob Trout speaking. We've been listening to another one of the pool broadcasts, and just in case that word might mystify you a bit, perhaps I can explain that this broadcast by our correspondent Charles Shaw in London is one of the many broadcasts being put out now from the Supreme Headquarters in Great Britain and available to the combined Allied radio networks. We just heard Mr. Shaw explain how our Columbia London staff, Edward R. Murrow, and he himself, Charles Shaw, started to handle the invasion news as it began to come out last night. Richard Hottelet, another member of our Columbia London staff, was with the Air Force. He made a trip in a Marauder, and he came back, and his broadcast was heard some hours ago as he described what he had seen as he made the trip in the Marauder over the enemy coast. And now we have some fresh news coming in on the ticker. Prime Minister Winston Churchill went before the House of Commons today and told the crowded House that an immense Allied armada of 4,000 ships with several thousand smaller craft have carried Allied forces across the Channel for the invasion of Europe. Prime Minister Churchill says that Allied commanders have reported that so far the invasion is proceeding according to plan. That is the very latest news. It comes to us from London, telling us that Prime Minister Churchill has told Commons the Allied Armada, which carried the troops across the Channel, consisted of 4,000 ships, several thousand smaller craft, and that so far Allied commanders report to him, Mr. Churchill, that the invasion, the liberation of the continent, is proceeding according to plan. That's the very latest from London. The story is coming in a form that we call here in the newsroom a running story. Perhaps there will be further details of what Mr. Churchill actually said in a few moments. But now it is time once again to pause for station identification. If our audience will bear with me and permit me, I should like to explain very carefully again to the staffs of our Columbia-affiliated stations around the country, we are continuing this invasion coverage broadcast, and we are going to pause very briefly for station identification. We're not ending the broadcast at all. We want them all to be back with us in exactly 15 seconds. The pause will be exactly 15 seconds. This is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System. Columbia's news headquarters in New York once again. Bob Trout speaking. We're continuing our coverage of the invasion of Europe. And I think that it would be a good idea to start now as we resume after that pause for station identification. It's a good idea to resume by repeating to you the brief bulletin that came in telling us all we know to date of what Prime Minister Churchill said before the House of Commons today. Mr. Winston Churchill went into the House of Commons, told the House that the Allied Armada, which carried the invasion force across the Channel to Europe, consisted of 4,000 ships and several thousand small boats. And Mr. Churchill then said that the Allied commanders have reported that so far the invasion is proceeding according to plan. Mr. Churchill said, a series of landings in force on the European continent occurred during the night and in the early morning hours. 1,000 first-line planes can be drawn upon by the Allied attacking forces as need be for the purposes of battle. Those are the quotations from Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and even as I speak to you, there are additions being brought in and put down on this desk, and I shall continue as they're brought in. The very next line says, Churchill also said that massed airborne landings have been successfully effected behind the German lines. Massed airborne landings successfully effected behind the German lines. I'm quoting the words of Prime Minister Winston Churchill. He's speaking or has spoken in the House of Commons, and the news of what he said is coming over sentence by sentence over our news machines and being brought here as it comes in. Continuing, Mr. Churchill said, the landings on the beaches are proceeding at various points at the present time. The fire of shore batteries has been largely quelled. And then Mr. Churchill said, obstacles which were constructed in the sea have not proved so difficult as was apprehended. Let me just read to you again those last three sentences that we have. They're very important. They're the latest news of the invasion. Winston Churchill in the House of Commons said, the landings on the beaches are proceeding at various points. The fire of shore batteries has been largely quelled, and obstacles which the Germans constructed in the sea have not proved so difficult as was thought before the invasion started. There will be more in a few moments on the talk of Prime Minister Churchill in the House of Commons. As it comes in, we shall give it to you, and eventually, when it's all in, we'll give you the whole thing. But now, here at Columbia's News headquarters, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Ned Calmer of CBS World News, who's been here with us all night. After doing his 11 o'clock broadcast last night, he stayed here through the entire invasion broadcast coverage we've been doing. Mr. Calmer is familiar with that part of the French coast where the reported landing has been made, and is in fact a former news correspondent of many years' experience in France. Mr. Calmer has been broadcasting to France recently in French for the Office of War Information and is heard regularly on the CBS network. And now here is Ned Calmer.
Between bulletins, let's take a geographical look at the developing military situation. As nearly as we know, up to now, our landings have been taking place on the beaches between Le Havre and Cherbourg on the French coast of the Channel. This is not officially stated by Allied headquarters. It's the persistent report of the German radio. Those beaches where we're apparently going in are some of the broadest, smoothest, and finest in the world. And this part of France is perhaps the best-known part of the coast to Americans. In peacetime, thousands of Americans passed through the picturesque port of Le Havre, now reported under bombardment by our warships. Other thousands have visited Deauville and Trouville in the heyday of American tourists' fashionable resorts. Fécamp and Dieppe are also ports to watch. These once peaceful sands have now been invaded with all the paraphernalia of war. Ships, guns, tanks, and barbed wire. The bathing beaches have been turned into German strongpoints. The waters where Americans splashed and frolicked a dozen years ago are now churning with a grimmer sort of activity. However, if you heard the earlier broadcast by CBS correspondent Richard Hottelet, who reported his flight in a Marauder medium bomber over a section of the Channel coast, there was little or no opposition to our landings so far as Hottelet could observe from the plane. So perhaps these beach defenses are not as formidable as the Nazi propagandists have been painting them for many weeks. Along the beaches in the so-called Bay of the Seine, so-called because the Seine empties into the Channel at Le Havre, one kind of warfare apparently has been taking place. But on the Normandy Peninsula, where our airborne and parachute troops are reported to have landed, another kind of fighting has been going on. Here, the country is either plateau or low mountain ranges, with cliffs several hundred feet high overlooking the sea. It wouldn't be possible to make effective landings from the water, so our men evidently have been dropped from the air. Of course, just back of this coastal area, France is thickly cultivated and studded with towns and cities. One of the cities which may be an objective is Caen. I'll spell that C-A-E-N, which lies inland about 8 miles from this coastal area I've just been describing. Another thing we must take into account, of course, is the effect of our pre-invasion bombing on the many highways, broad and narrow, the complex railway network which linked the German secondary defense areas with the coast. One of the tasks of our paratroops surely would be to seize and cut the key highways in this system. And the Norman peasant, the Channel fisherman who knows every inch of these roads and every foot of water along the shore, is bound to be of invaluable assistance in our operations. Taking a more general view, an advance started from this area, about 60 miles wide, from the mouth of the Seine to the westward. Such an advance might head for Paris, keeping the Seine on its left flank. On east of the Seine, the coast is much more hazardous, and landings between there and the Somme River would be much more difficult to carry out. I'll turn the microphone back now to Bob Trout.
We've been listening to Ned Calmer at Columbia's News headquarters in New York. A few more additions to the address which Prime Minister Winston Churchill is making in the House of Commons have now come in. However, I think that as this news is so fresh, as Mr. Churchill is revealing specific details which carry the story of the fighting definitely forward, I think perhaps we should start at the very beginning and go on from there. This is the way the bulletin first came in. London, Prime Minister Churchill told the House of Commons today that an immense Allied armada of 4,000 ships with several thousand smaller boats had carried the Allied forces across the Channel to begin the invasion of Europe. He said that massed airborne landings have been successfully made behind the German lines. And then Mr. Churchill said the landings on the beaches are proceeding at various points at this time. The fire of shore batteries has been largely quelled. The Prime Minister went on to say, obstacles which the Germans constructed in the sea have not proved so difficult as was thought before the invasion started. Then the Prime Minister said the American and British allies are sustained by about 11,000 first-line aircraft which can be drawn upon as needed. I'd like to repeat that sentence because in the original copy there was a slight error and the figure came out as 1,000. Actually, that figure is 11,000, and so I'll read the sentence again. The Prime Minister said the American-British allies are sustained by about 11,000 first-line aircraft which can be drawn upon as needed. So far, said Winston Churchill, the commanders who are engaged report that everything is proceeding according to plan. And then Mr. Churchill, who knows well the history of that phrase, said to the House of Commons, and what a plan. Then Mr. Churchill said the vast operation was undoubtedly the most complicated and the most difficult which has ever been made. I believe there's an addition to the story, this running story, of what Prime Minister Churchill is saying at Commons, and here is an addition. We shall furnish the enemy, he said, with a succession of surprises during the course of the fighting. The battle will grow constantly in scale and intensity for many weeks to come. I shall not attempt to speculate upon its course, but, said the Prime Minister, this I may say, that complete unity prevails throughout the Allied armies. There is a brotherhood in arms between us and our friends of the United States. The ardor and spirit of our troops, as I saw for myself as they were embarking in the last few days, was splendid to witness. And that is the first news of how the battle is going. That is the story so far of the address which Prime Minister Winston Churchill is making in the House of Commons. I repeated some of it as I'd already started to give it to you. More of it will be coming in, and we'll give it to you as it comes in. The very last few quotations were the freshest, and as all of Mr. Churchill's speech is studded with bits of definite information that we have not had before, I think that I should repeat the last edition. Mr. Churchill said, "We shall furnish the enemy with a succession of surprises during the course of the fighting. The battle will grow constantly in scale and intensity for many weeks to come." And then Mr. Churchill said, "I shall not attempt to speculate upon its course, but this I may say, that complete unity prevails throughout the Allied armies. There is a brotherhood in arms between us and our friends of the United States. The ardor and spirit of our troops, as I saw for myself as they were embarking in the last few days, was splendid to witness." Just had word that Mr. Churchill has indicated that he will announce further news later in the day. This may mean that the speech that Mr. Churchill has been making has now been ended. I should call it a statement, really. It's not a speech, a statement before the House of Commons. Perhaps this means that that statement has ended. Mr. Churchill gave us a good deal of news that we hadn't had before. There's only been one communique issued since the Allied command, the Supreme Command, announced the invasion had started, and that communique was exactly one sentence long. Mr. Churchill's statement in Commons did give us a great many specific details, and they carried the story of the invasion forward a great deal. And now the last word we have, just one sentence off the news machine, which says that the Prime Minister indicates he will announce further news later in the day. Needless to say, when he announces it, we shall bring it to you very promptly. Another interesting note, last night in Washington, General George C. Marshall, the Chief of Staff of the United States Army, whose forces now are committed to their very greatest test, declared in a pre-invasion address that the final action in the European war will come in a battle to the death for the Nazis and a battle to victory for the Allies. The confident words of Chief of Staff General Marshall were spoken at a special ceremony at the Soviet-Russian embassy in Washington last night, where he was awarded the Order of Suvorov, one of the highest of all Russian military decorations. An imposing list of dignitaries was puzzled when General Marshall suddenly left the embassy almost immediately after the ceremony without waiting for the customary buffet supper. No one knew exactly why the general had walked out of the ceremony, walked out rather after the ceremony, and walked out on the party which followed it, but the explanation, of course, came a few hours later with the announcement at 3:32 in the morning Eastern War Time that Allied troops were landing in France. The liberation of the continent has begun. A word on German propaganda, of which we shall be hearing a great deal now that the invasion has begun. We shall probably be hearing even more than we have heard these past 10 or 15 years. The battle is going to take some time, according to Mr. Churchill's indications. He said it will go on for weeks before it reaches its climax. I'm only paraphrasing his words, but that's what he said in effect. And now here's a note on the German propaganda, which will be active during those weeks, we may be sure. Columbia's shortwave listening station reports that Radio Berlin's first propaganda comment on the invasion was a flat statement that the invasion was undertaken because the orders of Moscow could not be evaded any longer. Our Columbia shortwave listening station recalls that for several months now, the Berlin propagandists have been trying to persuade their enemy audiences that the Allies would be forced to invade Europe because Joseph Stalin demanded an invasion. There's not much sign that anyone took them very seriously, not even in the countries which are friendly to Germany. Other Berlin propaganda so far this morning is just about what you'd expect. German broadcasters are talking about air defenses clicking into action and about German forces launching effective attacks against Allied formations. However, as you may have heard if you've been with us during this night-long broadcast, Allied correspondents who flew over the scene reported few signs of German resistance, so perhaps we can chalk that up as just another German effort to frighten us. And I might remind you that one of the Allied correspondents who flew over the scene and reported no fighter plane opposition at all from the Germans was Columbia's correspondent Richard Hotelet, who was out over the invasion coast in an Allied Marauder and who returned to broadcast sometime during the night, I've forgotten the time, to broadcast from Supreme Headquarters in London that there had been no German fighter plane resistance, none at all, but there had been light German flak. A further note on the running account of the statement by Prime Minister Churchill in the House of Commons just in. Mr. Churchill said in Commons, "There already are hopes that tactical surprise has been achieved." And that one sentence seems to be the only thing new to be added to what we have already heard about the statement of Prime Minister Winston Churchill in the House of Commons. There are lots of speeches. There have been lots of speeches and statements made during the course of this night, as you can very well imagine. Perhaps this will be a good point to give you a few excerpts. General Eisenhower, in his order of the day to his armies, who were then invading Europe, said, "Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark on a great crusade. Your task will not be an easy one. We will accept nothing less than full victory. People of Western Europe, the hour of your liberation is approaching." That is an excerpt from the order of the day issued by General Eisenhower to his troops of sea, land, and air as the invasion began. The order of the day was read on all Allied networks from Britain by Columbia's chief correspondent in London, Edward R. Murrow, along around 4 o'clock in the morning, New York time, I believe it was. Here's an excerpt from the statement of General John J. Pershing, the commander of the American forces during the First World War. "Today," said General Pershing, "the sons of American soldiers of 1917-1918 are engaged in a like war of liberation. I have every confidence that they, with their gallant brothers in arms, will win through to victory." Herbert Hoover is in with a quotation. It says, "The end of German tyranny is on the way. We have faith in our army." And the quotation has been handed me from Captain Ludwig Sertorius, who is known as a German military commentator, and who is quoted as saying, "The great contest between the Reich and the Anglo-Americans has begun. We can only stress the single-mindedness with which the German Wehrmacht is facing the enemy's onslaught. For in war, ethical values are at least as important as the number of soldiers and the quantity of their equipment." Now, that was a comment from Captain Sertorius. It was just handed me, but as I recall now, that comment was made before we had word that this really was the invasion. Back in the early hours when we were still, all we could tell you then was that the Germans had been saying the invasion had begun, but whether it really had or not, we did not know. And it might be a good point to remember that as far as we know, there may not be anybody named Captain Ludwig Sertorius. He's really a signature difference between DNB agency and Transocean. I'll repeat that in a moment, but first here's something from DNB. The German DNB agency has reported the fact of the Allied invasion of northern France to the German people at last. DNB has told the German people all about it in a press dispatch which was sent out 5 hours after the German agencies had begun to issue reports of the operations for foreign consumption. That means us. This fact is reported to us by the Office of War Information, which says the DNB dispatch to the German people began with this sentence: "The long-expected British-American attack on the north coast of France started last night." DNB put out its first invasion dispatch to the European press outside Germany. The German Transocean Agency which transmits German news propaganda by wireless for overseas consumption in the English language, had also begun to send out invasion reports for overseas consumption about 5 hours before the DNB domestic dispatch. We've had no word from Russia so far, incidentally. You never know. We might get some word. The Russian offensive, we've all understood, was to be coordinated with the beginning of the Allied invasion of Europe. Of course, coordination does not necessarily mean that the offensive on the Eastern Front would begin at the exact time and day that the invasion of the West across the Channel would begin. But everyone does expect that some sort of offensive on the Eastern Front, and probably a gigantic offensive, will be coordinated with the invasion across the Channel. We're also waiting, incidentally, as I told you a bit ago, for word from Tokyo. It'll be interesting to see what Tokyo, the Japanese partner of the Germans, has to say about this latest move, the beginning of the liberation of the continent of Europe. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, in his statement before the House of Commons, has given us the latest details about how the fighting is going. He just told the House of Commons a few minutes ago, I was giving you some of it then, he told the House of Commons a few minutes ago that the Allied invasion is going according to plan, and he said to the delighted members of Parliament, "What a plan." Mr. Churchill said that during the night a series of landings were made in force along the French coast by more than 4,000 ships, together with several thousand smaller boats. And then the Prime Minister said that the massed airborne landing behind the German lines had been successfully made. And he said that 11,000 first-line planes can be drawn upon for the purpose of supporting the land armies. And then he also told us that fire from the shore batteries has been largely overcome. Now, I think this might be a good moment. If there are a good many of you, I assume, still tuning in, who have still perhaps not even heard that the invasion had started, this might be a good moment to read to you the only communique which has come out of the Supreme Allied Headquarters so far since we got the news that the invasion had begun. That communique is very brief, and here it is. Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France. That communique was read from Supreme Allied Headquarters in Britain at 32 minutes past 3 o'clock in the morning, Eastern War Time, this morning or last night, as you prefer. The story has been carried beyond that news given in the communique. It's been carried beyond that now by the news which was given us by Prime Minister Winston Churchill in his statement at the House of Commons. But still, that one-sentence communique is historic, and that will always be the one that will be in the history books as the one sentence which announced that finally the liberation of the continent of Europe had begun. I've just given you a few of the details, repeated them rather, from Prime Minister Churchill's statement in the House of Commons, and I might remind you once again that the Prime Minister said, he indicated, rather, he did not say, the Prime Minister indicated that he will have further news later in the day. Also, later in the day, we are expecting a broadcast by King George VI of Great Britain, and also we hear there will be a broadcast from General de Gaulle, who now is in London. We're not sure of it, but there very probably will be. In addition, of course, we're getting broadcasts from Britain all the time, broadcasts from our own correspondents and from correspondents who are pooling their news by arrangement in these first days of the invasion. We haven't had any now for a few minutes. There was a time when, during the night, when we were getting these broadcasts from London within 30 seconds of one another, and at any moment now, of course, we might be interrupted to be told that another one is coming up. And as a matter of fact, someone is now coming in with a note to give me. If you will excuse me for a moment, I'll look at it. It is not from London, but it says that we have word now from our Washington news headquarters that an officer of the French General Staff is standing by to give us a description of the portions of the French coast which the Germans say we have invaded. So for an introduction and this analysis, we take you now to Washington. Don Pryor reporting.
As soon as General Eisenhower's communique confirmed the Allied invasion of northern France, one of the first men in Washington to be notified was Lieutenant Colonel Victor M. Morrison of the French military mission in Washington. He came immediately to the CBS Washington newsroom and has been poring over press service reports. His interest in this morning's news is intensely personal as well as professional. Colonel Morrison.
This morning at dawn, after a series of feints, Allied troops landed on the continent. According to the latest German reports, these landings were on the French northwest coast between Cherbourg and Le Havre. The Germans say that the center of gravity of this battle is around Caen. This part of France is very familiar to me, since I have spent many summers on the Normandy coast, and my wife's family is living in Bayeux, 20 miles north of Caen and only 6 miles from the coast. North of Le Havre, the beach is composed of high cliffs that are not suitable for a landing. The estuary of the Seine is much lower, as well as all the part of the coast to the north of Caen. Between Caen and the estuary of the Vire, the beaches are composed of high cliffs and low beaches alternately. The estuary of the Vire is very low and looks much like the coast of the Mont Saint-Michel. Between Carentan and Cherbourg, and especially near Carentan, the beach can be used easily for landing purposes. Inland, in the Caen region, the country is rather flat and is known as the Plain of Caen. This is an ideal terrain for armored cars and motorized vehicles. Between Bayeux and Cherbourg, the country is hilly and divided into small fields surrounded by high hedges. These will help the German defenders. The main road in this part of the country runs from Paris to Cherbourg and parallels the coast from Lisieux to Cherbourg. Several roads of less importance link the interior of the country to the small ports along the channel. All this country between Lisieux and Cherbourg is served by only one rail line not far from the Paris-Cherbourg highway.